The year 476 AD marked not merely the end of an empire, but the violent birth pangs of an entirely new European civilization. When Odoacer, the Germanic chieftain commanding a motley collection of Heruli, Rugi and Siri warriors, deposed the boy emperor Romulus Augustulus and sent the imperial regalia to Constantinople, he unknowingly triggered a transformation that would reshape the continent for the next 1,000 years. The Western Roman Empire, that colossal administrative machine which had governed territories from Hadrian's Wall to the Sahara Desert, collapsed not with a single catastrophic blow, but through a century-long hemorrhaging of authority, resources, and territorial control. The Germanic peoples who swept across former Roman frontiers were not the savage hordes of Roman propaganda, but sophisticated tribal confederations with their own complex social hierarchies, legal traditions, and military organisations. The Visigoths had already established themselves in southwestern Gaul and much of Hispania following their sack of Rome in 410 under Alaric I. Their kingdom, centred initially at Toulouse before relocating to Toledo, represented a fascinating hybrid of Roman administrative practices and Germanic warrior culture. King Euric, who ruled from 466 to 484, expanded Visigothic territory to encompass nearly the entire Iberian Peninsula and much of southern Gaul, creating the first truly post-Roman kingdom to achieve lasting stability. The Visigothic legal system exemplified the complex cultural synthesis occurring across former Roman territories. The Breviary of Alaric, promulgated in 506, attempted to codify Roman law for the kingdom's Roman subjects while maintaining separate Germanic legal traditions for the Visigothic population. This legal dualism reflected the practical challenges facing Germanic rulers who found themselves governing populations vastly outnumbering their own people. The Visigoths, perhaps numbering no more than 200,000 individuals, ruled over several million Hispano-Romans who retained their language, customs, and local administrative structures. In Italy, the situation proved even more complex. Odoacer's reign lasted only 17 years before Theodoric the Great, king of the Ostrogoths, invaded the peninsula at the behest of Emperor Zeno in Constantinople. The siege of Ravenna, which lasted from 489 to 493, demonstrated both the military prowess of the Ostrogoths and the sophisticated defensive capabilities that Roman engineering had bequeathed to the post-imperial world. When Theodoric finally entered Ravenna, he murdered Odoacer with his own hands during what was supposedly a reconciliation banquet, establishing Ostrogothic rule over Italy through treachery as much as military conquest. Theodoric's kingdom represented perhaps the most successful attempt to blend Germanic and Roman traditions. The Ostrogothic king maintained the Roman Senate, preserved the consulship, and kept much of the imperial bureaucracy intact while establishing a parallel Germanic administrative structure. His court at Ravenna became a centre of learning where Roman intellectuals like Boethius and Cassiodorus served alongside Gothic nobles. The famous mosaics of San Vitale and Sant'Apollinare, though completed after Theodoric's death, reflected the cultural sophistication his reign had fostered. The Ostrogothic military organisation revealed the evolution of Germanic warfare in the post-Roman world. Theodoric's armies combined traditional Gothic heavy cavalry with Roman infantry tactics and siege techniques. The Gothic warriors, distinguished by their long swords, round shields, and distinctive helmet designs featuring elaborate metalwork, represented a military elite that had absorbed Roman tactical knowledge while maintaining their own martial traditions. These warriors held land grants throughout Italy in exchange for military service, creating a proto-feudal system that would influence later medieval developments. North of the Alps, the Frankish kingdoms emerged as the most dynamic and ultimately most successful of the Germanic successor states. Unlike the Visigoths and Ostrogoths, who had migrated as unified peoples under royal leadership, the Franks represented a confederation of tribes that had gradually expanded westward from their original territories along the Rhine. Clovis I, who ruled from approximately 481 to 511, transformed this loose confederation into a unified kingdom stretching from the Loire to the Rhine through a combination of military conquest, political marriage, and religious conversion. Clovis's conversion to Catholic Christianity around 496, following his victory over the Alemanni at the Battle of Tolbiac, represented a crucial turning point in European history. Unlike the Arian Christianity adopted by most other Germanic peoples, Clovis's embrace of Catholic orthodoxy aligned the Frankish kingdom with the religious allegiance of its Gallo-Roman subjects, and more importantly, with the powerful Gallic episcopate. This religious alignment provided the Franks with significant advantages in their subsequent conflicts with the Arian Visigoths and Burgundians. The Frankish legal system, codified in the Salic law during Clovis's reign, preserved many traditional Germanic customs while incorporating Roman legal concepts. The elaborate system of monetary compensation for crimes, known as Wehrgild, reflected the Germanic emphasis on preventing blood feuds through financial restitution. A free Frank's life was valued at 200 solidi, while a Roman's was worth only 100 solida, revealing the ethnic hierarchy that characterized early Frankish society. Yet the code also protected women's property rights and established procedures for legal proceedings that drew heavily on Roman precedents. The Catholic Church emerged as the most important institution bridging the gap between Roman and Germanic civilizations. As imperial authority collapsed, bishops often found themselves serving as the de facto administrators of their cities, negotiating with Germanic kings, organising food distribution, and maintaining public order. The episcopal courts handled civil disputes, while monasteries preserved classical manuscripts and maintained schools that kept literacy alive during the transition period. Pope Gregory the Great, who served from 590 to 604, exemplified the Church's expanding temporal authority. His correspondence reveals a pope who functioned as much as a secular ruler as a spiritual leader, negotiating with the Lombard kings who had invaded Italy in 568, organising the defence of Rome and managing vast ecclesiastical estates throughout the former Western Empire. Gregory's pastoral rule became the standard manual for episcopal administration, while his liturgical reforms standardised Catholic worship practices across Europe. Monasticism provided another crucial mechanism for cultural preservation and transmission. The Rule of St. Benedict, written around 530 at Monte Cassino, established the organisational framework that would govern Western monasticism for centuries. Benedictine monasteries became centres of agricultural innovation, manuscript copying, and education. The monastic scriptoriums preserved not only Christian texts, but also classical works by Virgil, Cicero, and other Roman authors, ensuring their survival through the turbulent centuries ahead. The transformation of urban life represented one of the most dramatic changes of this period. Roman cities, with their forums, baths, theatres, and elaborate infrastructure, gradually gave way to smaller, more defensible settlements centred around episcopal complexes or royal courts. Trier, once the capital of Gaul and home to over 100,000 inhabitants, shrank to perhaps 10,000 residents by 600 AD. The magnificent Roman baths fell into disrepair, while the population concentrated around the cathedral and its associated buildings. Yet this urban decline did not represent simple decay, but rather adaptation to new economic and political realities. The Mediterranean trade networks that had sustained Roman urbanism gradually gave way to more localised exchange systems. Germanic kings established their courts in former Roman cities but transformed them according to their own needs and traditions. The palace complex became the new centre of power, while the old Roman administrative buildings were abandoned or converted to new purposes. The economic foundations of the new Germanic kingdoms differed substantially from those of the Roman Empire. Where Rome had relied on taxation, tribute and slave labour, the Germanic kingdoms operated through personal relationships between kings and their warrior followings. Land grants, gifts of weapons and jewellery, and shares of plunder bound the Germanic military elite to their rulers through ties of personal loyalty rather than bureaucratic obligation. This transformation of economic relationships had profound implications for European development. The Roman system of standardized coinage gradually gave way to a more primitive exchange economy based on barter and gift-giving. Gold solidi continued to circulate, particularly in the Mediterranean regions, but silver and bronze coinage became increasingly rare. The elaborate Roman tax system, with its professional collectors and detailed records, collapsed as Germanic kings proved unable or unwilling to maintain such complex administrative machinery. Agricultural practices also evolved during this transitional period. The Roman villa system, with its slave-worked latifundia, gradually gave way to smaller holdings worked by free peasants or semi-free coloni. Germanic agricultural techniques, particularly the heavy plough capable of turning the dense soils of northern Europe, slowly spread southward. The three-field system, which would become standard in medieval agriculture, began to emerge in Frankish territories during the 6th century. The military technologies and tactics of the Germanic peoples represented a significant departure from Roman practices. Where Roman legions had relied on disciplined infantry formations supported by auxiliary cavalry, Germanic armies centred on heavily armed warrior elites, fighting primarily on horseback or as heavily armoured foot soldiers. The Francisca, the distinctive Frankish throwing axe, became a symbol of Germanic military prowess, while the long swords carried by Gothic and Lombard warriors demonstrated sophisticated metallurgical skills. Fortification techniques also evolved as Germanic kings adapted Roman defensive strategies to their own needs. The great Roman frontier fortifications like Hadrian's Wall were gradually abandoned, but new defensive structures emerged around royal residences and important monasteries. These early medieval fortifications, often built on hilltops or other naturally defensive positions, represented the ancestors of the great castles that would dominate the later medieval landscape. The linguistic transformation of Europe during this period reflected the broader cultural changes occurring across the continent. Latin remained the language of the church and of what remained of formal administration, but the spoken Latin of the provinces gradually evolved into the Romance languages. Germanic languages established themselves as the dominant vernaculars in much of northern Europe, while Celtic languages retreated to the western peripheries of Britain and Ireland. This linguistic diversity created new challenges for the emerging Germanic kingdoms. Kings needed to communicate with subjects who spoke different languages and followed different legal traditions. The development of written vernacular literature, beginning with Gothic translations of the Bible in the 4th century, represented early attempts to bridge these linguistic divides. The period from 476 to 600 AD thus witnessed not merely the collapse of Roman authority, but the emergence of entirely new forms of political, social, and cultural organisation. The Germanic kingdoms that arose on Roman ruins combined elements of both traditions while developing innovative solutions to the challenges of governing populations across vast territories. These hybrid institutions would provide the foundation for the remarkable expansion and development of medieval European civilization in the centuries that followed. The Germanic kingdoms established in the wake of Rome's collapse faced an inevitable test of survival as the 7th century drew to a close. While the Visigothic kingdom in Hispania had achieved remarkable stability and the Lombards consolidated their grip on northern Italy, it was the Frankish realm that would emerge as the dominant force in Western Europe. The Merovingian dynasty, descendants of Clovis, had ruled the Franks for over 2 centuries, but their power had gradually eroded as real authority shifted to the palace mayors who controlled the royal household and commanded the kingdom's military forces. The Battle of Tertry in 687 marked the decisive moment when Charles Martel's grandfather, Pepin of Herstal, defeated the Neustrian mayor Berchar and established Austrasian dominance over the entire Frankish realm. This victory consolidated power in the hands of the Pepinid family, who would later become known as the Carolingians after Charles Martel's son Charlemagne. Pepin of Herstal's control extended from the Rhine eastward into Thuringia and southward to the borders of Burgundy, creating the largest unified territory in Western Europe since the fall of Rome. Charles Martel, who assumed power as mayor of the palace in 714, transformed the Frankish military into the most formidable fighting force of the early 8th century. His nickname Martel, meaning hammer, reflected his reputation for crushing enemies through relentless campaigning and tactical innovation. Charles reorganised the Frankish army around heavily armed cavalry, requiring his followers to maintain war horses and the expensive equipment necessary for mounted combat. This military revolution demanded substantial resources, which Charles obtained by secularising church lands and redistributing them to his warriors in exchange for military service. The Frankish heavy cavalry that emerged under Charles Martel represented a significant evolution from earlier Germanic military practices. These mounted warriors wore burny mail shirts extending to their knees, carried round shields reinforced with iron bosses, and wielded long spears designed for mounted combat. Their horses, bred for size and strength rather than speed, could carry the weight of an armoured warrior while maintaining the mobility necessary for effective cavalry charges. The stirrup, introduced from the east during this period, provided the stability needed for mounted warriors to deliver devastating lance attacks without being unseated. Charles Martel's most famous victory came at the Battle of Poitiers in 732, where his forces halted the northward advance of Abd al-Rahman's raiders from Al-Andalus. The Frankish infantry, arranged in a dense phalanx formation, withstood repeated cavalry charges before Charles's mounted reserves struck the decisive blow. Contemporary chronicles describe the Franks standing like a wall of ice, their disciplined ranks absorbing the shock of enemy attacks before counter-attacking with devastating effect. This victory established Charles as the defender of Christian Europe and demonstrated the effectiveness of his military reforms. The political implications of Poitiers extended far beyond its immediate military significance. Charles's victory enhanced his prestige throughout the Christian world and strengthened his position relative to the nominal Merovingian kings who continued to occupy the Frankish throne. Pope Gregory III, facing pressure from the Lombards in Italy, began corresponding with Charles about potential military assistance, marking the beginning of the Frankish papal alliance that would reshape European politics. Pepin the Short, Charles Martel's son, completed the Pepinid usurpation of royal authority through a carefully orchestrated coup in 751. Rather than simply deposing the last Merovingian king, Childeric III, Pepin sought legitimacy through papal approval. Pope Zacharias declared that whoever exercised real power should rightfully hold the royal title, providing religious sanction for Pepin's assumption of the crown. The ceremony at Soissons, where Pepin was anointed with holy oil by Archbishop Boniface, established a new precedent for royal legitimacy based on ecclesiastical approval rather than merely hereditary succession. Pepin's alliance with the papacy bore immediate fruit when he crossed the Alps in 754 and 756 to defeat the Lombard king Aistulf, who had been threatening papal territories around Rome. These campaigns, known as the Italian expeditions, resulted in the creation of the Papal States when Pepin donated the conquered Lombard territories to the Pope. The donation of Pepin established the temporal authority of the papacy over central Italy and created a precedent for secular rulers to grant territory to the Church in exchange for spiritual legitimacy. The Frankish military machine that Pepin employed in Italy demonstrated the sophistication of Carolingian warfare. Frankish armies could move rapidly across long distances, maintain complex supply lines, and conduct effective siege operations against heavily fortified positions. The siege of Pavia in 756 showcased Frankish engineering capabilities, as Pepin's forces constructed elaborate siege works, including catapults, battering rams, and protective shelters for attacking infantry. The Lombards, despite their reputation as fierce warriors, proved unable to withstand the sustained pressure of Frankish siege tactics. Charlemagne, who became sole king of the Franks in 771 following the death of his brother Carloman, inherited a kingdom that already dominated Western Europe, but was destined to expand it into an empire rivaling the achievements of Rome itself. Standing nearly 6 feet tall in an age when most men barely reached 5.5 feet, Charlemagne possessed the physical presence necessary to command respect from his warrior nobility. Contemporary descriptions emphasise his penetrating blue eyes, flowing moustache, and powerful voice that could be heard across a battlefield or council chamber. The Saxon Wars, which occupied much of Charlemagne's reign from 772 to 804, represented the most sustained and brutal of his military campaigns. The Saxon tribes, inhabiting the territories between the Rhine and Elbe rivers, had remained largely independent of Frankish authority despite centuries of pressure from their western neighbours. These Germanic peoples maintained their traditional polytheistic religion, worshipping Wotan and other ancestral deities at sacred groves and springs scattered throughout their forested homeland. Charlemagne's initial invasion of Saxony in 772 targeted the Irminsul, a sacred pillar that served as the central shrine of Saxon paganism. The destruction of this religious symbol, described in Frankish chronicles as reaching toward the heavens and supporting the entire world, demonstrated Charlemagne's intention to eliminate Saxon culture as well as Saxon independence. The wealth seized from the shrine, including massive quantities of gold and silver, accumulated over centuries of offerings, helped finance the subsequent decades of warfare. Saxon resistance proved far more determined than Charlemagne had anticipated. Widukind, the Saxon leader who emerged as the primary opponent of Frankish expansion, employed guerrilla tactics that frustrated Frankish attempts at conventional conquest. Saxon warriors would submit during the summer campaigning season, only to rebel again once Charlemagne's armies withdrew for winter quarters. These cycles of submission and revolt characterised the first decade of the Saxon Wars, forcing Charlemagne to develop new strategies for permanent conquest. The massacre at Verdun in 782 marked the most notorious episode of the Saxon Wars. Following a Saxon victory over a Frankish army at the Battle of Suntel, Charlemagne ordered the execution of 4,500 Saxon prisoners who had allegedly broken their oaths of loyalty. This mass killing, conducted by beheading over several days, reflected both Charlemagne's frustration with Saxon resistance and his determination to break Saxon morale through terror. The Verdun massacre became a rallying cry for Saxon resistance and prolonged the conflict for another 2 decades. Charlemagne's conquest of the Lombard kingdom in 774 demonstrated his ability to conduct successful campaigns on multiple fronts simultaneously. King Desiderius, seeking to restore Lombard independence from Frankish influence, had allied with Charlemagne's deceased brother's widow and threatened papal territories. Charlemagne's response was swift and decisive. Frankish armies crossed the Alps through multiple passes, outflanking Lombard defensive positions and forcing Desiderius to retreat to his capital at Pavia. The siege of Pavia lasted from September 773 to June 774, testing both Frankish persistence and Lombard endurance. Charlemagne maintained the siege through the harsh Alpine winter, demonstrating the logistical capabilities that set Carolingian armies apart from their contemporaries. The Frankish supply system, based on requisitions from conquered territories and tribute from allied peoples, could sustain large armies for extended periods far from their homeland. When Pavia finally surrendered, Charlemagne assumed the title King of the Lombards and incorporated northern Italy directly into his expanding realm. The Spanish March, established following Charlemagne's expedition across the Pyrenees in 778, created a buffer zone between the Frankish kingdom and the territories controlled from Cordoba. Although the campaign itself achieved mixed results, including the famous defeat at Roncevaux where Roland and the Frankish rearguard were annihilated by Basque mountaineers, Charlemagne succeeded in establishing Frankish control over the region between the Pyrenees and the Ebro River. Barcelona became the capital of this frontier province, serving as a base for further expansion southward and a centre for Christian settlement in formerly territories. The administrative system that Charlemagne developed to govern his vast territories represented a sophisticated evolution of earlier Frankish practices. The kingdom was divided into counties administered by counts who served as royal representatives with authority over military, judicial, and fiscal matters within their jurisdictions. These counts, drawn primarily from the Frankish nobility, owed their positions directly to royal appointment and could be removed at the king's pleasure. The system provided centralised control while accommodating local variations in law and custom. Charlemagne's missi dominici, royal envoys who travelled throughout the empire inspecting local administration and hearing appeals, ensured that royal authority remained effective even in distant provinces. These investigators, typically consisting of one ecclesiastical and one lay official, possessed broad powers to correct abuses, settle disputes, and report on local conditions. The capitularies they carried contained detailed instructions for local officials, covering everything from military obligations to market regulations and judicial procedures. The Carolingian educational revival began as a practical necessity for effective governance, but evolved into a comprehensive programme of cultural renewal. Charlemagne's court attracted scholars from throughout Europe, including Alcuin of York, Peter of Pisa, Paul the Deacon, and Theodulf of Orleans. These intellectuals, representing the most advanced learning of their time, established schools and scriptoriums that would preserve and transmit classical knowledge to future generations. Alcuin's influence on Carolingian education proved particularly significant. This Anglo-Saxon scholar, educated at the Cathedral School of York, brought to Charlemagne's court the most advanced pedagogical methods available in contemporary Europe. Alcuin reorganised the palace school, established standardised curricula for cathedral and monastery schools throughout the empire, and supervised the production of corrected texts of classical and Christian authors. His educational programme emphasised the trivium of grammar, rhetoric, and dialectic as the foundation for all higher learning. The Carolingian minuscule script, developed in the scriptoriums supervised by Alcuin and his associates, revolutionised medieval literacy. This clear, standardised handwriting replaced the various local scripts that had made manuscripts difficult to read and copy accurately. The new script facilitated the production of corrected texts and enabled the rapid dissemination of written materials throughout the empire. Modern printed letters derive directly from Carolingian minuscule, demonstrating the lasting influence of this educational reform. Monastic scriptoriums became the centres of manuscript production and preservation during the Carolingian period. The Abbey of Tours, under Alcuin's direction, produced magnificent illuminated manuscripts, including multiple copies of the Bible, works by the Church Fathers, and classical texts by Virgil, Cicero, and Livy. These scriptoriums employed teams of scribes, illuminators, and bookbinders who could produce hundreds of manuscripts annually. The survival of classical literature depends largely on copies made in Carolingian scriptoriums, as most earlier manuscripts have been lost. The Palace School at Aachen attracted students from throughout Europe and served as a model for educational institutions across the empire. Young nobles received instruction in Latin grammar, rhetoric, mathematics, astronomy and theology, alongside practical training in military skills and court etiquette. This educational programme created a literate administrative class, capable of implementing royal policies and maintaining written records. The graduates of the Palace School staffed the royal chancery, served as counts and bishops, and established similar schools in their own territories. Charlemagne's coronation as Roman Emperor on Christmas Day 800 represented the culmination of his political achievements and marked a fundamental transformation in medieval political theory. Pope Leo III, facing serious accusations of misconduct from Roman nobles, sought Charlemagne's protection and support. The Frankish king's arrival in Rome to investigate these charges placed him in the position of judging the Pope himself, demonstrating the extent of his authority over ecclesiastical affairs. The coronation ceremony at St. Peter's Basilica followed carefully orchestrated symbolism designed to emphasise both imperial authority and papal legitimacy. As Charlemagne knelt in prayer before the altar, Pope Leo placed a golden crown upon his head, while the assembled Romans acclaimed him as Augustus and Emperor of the Romans. This acclamation, echoing the ceremonies of ancient Rome, suggested popular approval for the restoration of imperial authority in the West. The political implications of the imperial coronation extended far beyond ceremonial significance. Charlemagne's assumption of the imperial title challenged the exclusive claims of the Byzantine emperors to Roman legitimacy and established a rival centre of imperial authority in Western Europe. The Byzantines, who had regarded themselves as the sole heirs of Rome since 476, initially refused to recognise Charlemagne's imperial status, leading to diplomatic tensions and occasional military conflicts. The relationship between emperor and pope established by the coronation created lasting tensions within medieval political theory. While Charlemagne clearly dominated Pope Leo and treated the papacy as subordinate to imperial authority, the fact that the pope had crowned the emperor suggested papal superiority in spiritual matters. This ambiguity would generate centuries of conflict between imperial and papal claims to supreme authority over Christian Europe. Charlemagne's imperial court at Aachen consciously emulated the grandeur of ancient Rome, while incorporating distinctly Frankish and Christian elements. The palace chapel, modelled on the Church of San Vitale in Ravenna, featured elaborate mosaics depicting Christ in majesty surrounded by the 24 elders of the Apocalypse. The throne room contained classical columns and marble decorations seized from Roman buildings in Italy, while Charlemagne's throne itself was positioned to overlook the altar, emphasising the sacred nature of imperial authority. The daily routine at the imperial court reflected both the administrative demands of governing a vast empire and the ceremonial requirements of imperial dignity. Charlemagne held regular audiences for petitioners, presided over judicial proceedings, and received embassies from foreign rulers including the Byzantine emperor and the Abbasid caliph. The elaborate court ceremonial, influenced by Byzantine practices but adapted to Frankish customs, reinforced the emperor's exalted status while maintaining the personal relationships that bound the Frankish nobility to their ruler. The economic foundations of the Carolingian Empire depended on agricultural production supplemented by tribute from conquered peoples and profits from long-distance trade. The great estates, or villa, that supported the imperial household and rewarded royal followers represented sophisticated agricultural enterprises employing hundreds of workers and producing diverse crops and manufactured goods. The Capitular de Villis, issued around 800, provided detailed instructions for estate management covering everything from crop rotation to the breeding of livestock and the training of craftsmen. Carolingian monetary policy reflected both practical administrative needs and imperial aspirations. Charlemagne reformed the Frankish coinage system, establishing the silver denarius as the standard unit of exchange and mandating uniform weights and measures throughout the empire. Royal mints in major cities produced coins bearing the emperor's name and title, while strict regulations prohibited counterfeiting and ensured the purity of precious metals. This monetary standardization facilitated trade and taxation, while reinforcing imperial authority through the widespread circulation of royal symbols. The Carolingian Renaissance represented far more than an educational reform. It constituted a comprehensive cultural renewal that established the intellectual foundations for medieval European civilization. The scholars assembled at Charlemagne's court did not merely preserve classical learning, but actively engaged with ancient texts, producing commentaries, theological treatises, and original works that advanced human knowledge. Their efforts ensured that the intellectual achievements of antiquity would survive the political fragmentation that followed Charlemagne's death, and provide the basis for later cultural developments. The monastery of Lindisfarne had stood as a beacon of Christian learning and devotion for over a century when the dragon-prowed ships appeared on the horizon on June 8, 793. The monks, accustomed to the peaceful rhythm of prayer and scholarship, could hardly comprehend the ferocity that was about to descend upon their sacred island. The Northmen who stormed ashore wielded broad-bladed axes and pattern-welded swords, their round shields painted in bold colours and reinforced with iron bosses. They wore burny mail shirts that reached to their thighs, conical helmets with nose guards, and thick woolen cloaks fastened with elaborate bronze brooches. The attack lasted only hours, but its psychological impact reverberated across Christian Europe like thunder across a clear sky. These raiders represented the vanguard of a demographic and economic explosion that had been building across Scandinavia throughout the 8th century. The Norse population had grown substantially during the preceding decades of relative peace, while agricultural improvements had increased food production and supported larger communities. Technological advances in shipbuilding, particularly the development of the shallow draft longship with its flexible, clinker-built hull, had given Scandinavian seafarers unprecedented mobility and range. The political fragmentation of Charlemagne's empire after 814 created opportunities for enterprising warriors to exploit weakened coastal defences and extract tribute from terrified populations. The Viking longship represented perhaps the most sophisticated naval technology of the early medieval period. These vessels, typically measuring 60 to 80 feet in length, featured shallow drafts that allowed them to navigate rivers far inland, while maintaining the seaworthiness necessary for ocean voyages. The flexible construction, with overlapping oak planks held together by iron rivets and leather lashings, enabled the ships to bend with ocean swells rather than breaking apart in heavy seas. A single square sail woven from wool provided propulsion in favourable winds, while 32 oars allowed the crew to maintain speed and manoeuvrability regardless of weather conditions. The crews that manned these vessels came from all levels of Scandinavian society, united by the prospect of wealth and glory rather than social status. Jarls, the wealthy landowners who often organised raiding expeditions, fought alongside carls, free farmers seeking to improve their fortunes, and even thralls who could earn their freedom through distinguished service. Each warrior brought his own weapons and equipment, creating a diverse array of military gear that reflected both personal wealth and regional preferences. Danes favoured the long-handled battle axe, while Norwegians preferred the broad-bladed sword, and Swedes often carried the skrammersax, a single-edged fighting knife that could serve as both weapon and tool. The initial phase of Viking expansion focused primarily on hit-and-run raids against monasteries and coastal settlements that offered rich plunder with minimal resistance. The monastery of Rathlin Island fell to Norwegian raiders in 795, followed by attacks on Iona, Lambay Island, and dozens of other ecclesiastical sites along the Irish coast. These religious foundations had accumulated substantial wealth through centuries of donations and land grants, making them irresistible targets for raiders who faced no organised military opposition. The monks' commitment to pacifism and their isolated locations made them particularly vulnerable to sudden attacks from the sea. Viking tactical doctrine emphasised speed, surprise, and psychological warfare over prolonged combat. Raiding parties typically numbered between 30 and 60 warriors, small enough to maintain mobility while large enough to overwhelm local defences. The raiders would beach their ships at dawn, strike swiftly at their target, and withdraw before organised resistance could materialise. The mere sight of dragon-headed prows on the horizon was often sufficient to cause coastal populations to flee inland, abandoning their possessions to the approaching Northmen. The wealth extracted from these early raids transformed Scandinavian society and provided the resources necessary for larger and more ambitious expeditions. Silver coins from the Carolingian Empire, Anglo-Saxon England, and the Islamic world flowed northward in unprecedented quantities, creating new forms of social stratification based on accumulated treasure rather than traditional land ownership. Successful raiders invested their profits in larger ships, better equipment, and expanded households that could support more ambitious ventures. The establishment of permanent Viking bases marked a fundamental shift from seasonal raiding to systematic conquest and settlement. The great army that landed in East Anglia in 865 represented a new type of Viking force, numbering in the thousands rather than dozens, and equipped for extended campaigning rather than quick raids. Led by the sons of the legendary Ragnar Lothbrok, including Ivar the Boneless and Halfdan Ragnarsson, this massive expedition conquered the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms of Northumbria, East Anglia, and Mercia within a decade. The Viking conquest of York in 866 demonstrated the sophisticated military capabilities that the Northmen had developed through decades of warfare. The city's Roman walls, which had protected it for centuries, proved inadequate against Viking siege techniques that combined direct assault with psychological warfare. The Vikings employed mobile siege towers, battering rams, and coordinated attacks from multiple directions, while maintaining their traditional emphasis on individual heroism and battlefield prowess. King Aiel of Northumbria died in the fighting, allegedly subjected to the Blood Eagle, a ritual execution that involved cutting the victim's ribs and pulling out his lungs to form the shape of an eagle's wings. The establishment of the Danelaw in eastern England created the first major Viking political entity outside Scandinavia. This territory, stretching from the Thames to the Scottish border, operated under Scandinavian law and customs while maintaining trade relationships with both the remaining Anglo-Saxon kingdoms and the Viking homelands. The 5 boroughs of Lincoln, Nottingham, Derby, Leicester and Stamford served as administrative centres where Viking jarls administered justice according to traditional Norse legal procedures that emphasised compensation over punishment and community involvement in dispute resolution. Viking settlement patterns in the Danelaw reflected both military necessity and agricultural opportunity. The invaders established fortified camps at strategic locations along rivers and Roman roads, creating defensive networks that could support each other during Anglo-Saxon counterattacks. These camps gradually evolved into permanent towns as Viking warriors brought their families from Scandinavia and established farms in the surrounding countryside. Archaeological evidence reveals that Viking settlers introduced new agricultural techniques, including the heavy plough and improved crop rotation systems that increased productivity on the heavy clay soils of eastern England. The cultural synthesis that emerged in the Danelaw combined Scandinavian and Anglo-Saxon elements in ways that enriched both traditions. Viking settlers adopted Christianity while maintaining many of their traditional customs and legal practices. Anglo-Saxon craftsmen learned Norse metalworking techniques, producing weapons and jewellery that incorporated both artistic traditions. The English language absorbed hundreds of Scandinavian words, many of which remain in common use today, including fundamental terms like sky, egg, knife, and husband. Alfred the Great's resistance to Viking expansion demonstrated that effective leadership and military innovation could successfully counter Norse advantages in mobility and surprise. The West Saxon king reorganised his kingdom's defences around a network of fortified towns called burhs, each positioned within a day's march of its neighbours and garrisoned by local militias. This system denied the Vikings the quick victories they needed to maintain momentum while providing secure bases for Anglo-Saxon counterattacks. The Battle of Edington in 878 marked the turning point in the Anglo-Saxon struggle against Viking conquest. Alfred's forces, fighting with the desperation of men defending their homeland, broke the Danish shield wall through sustained pressure and superior discipline. The Viking leader Guthrum, wounded in the fighting and facing the destruction of his army, agreed to convert to Christianity and withdraw his forces to the territories already under Danish control. Alfred's victory established the principle that Viking expansion could be contained through effective military organisation and determined resistance. The development of Viking trade networks transformed Scandinavia from a peripheral region into a central hub of European commerce. Swedish merchants established trading posts along the rivers of Russia, creating a commercial route that connected the Baltic Sea with Constantinople and the Islamic world. The Volga trade route carried amber, furs and slaves southward, while bringing silver, silk and spices northward to Scandinavian markets. Archaeological discoveries in Sweden have revealed hoards containing coins from as far away as Samarkand and Baghdad, testifying to the extent of these commercial connections. The foundation of Dublin in 841 created the first major Viking city outside Scandinavia and demonstrated Norse capabilities in urban planning and administration. The settlement, strategically positioned at the confluence of the River Liffey and the Irish Sea, served as both a military base for raids into the Irish interior and a commercial centre for trade with Britain and continental Europe. The city's defences included earthen ramparts topped with wooden palisades, while the harbour could accommodate dozens of longships and merchant vessels simultaneously. Viking expansion into the North Atlantic represented perhaps the most remarkable achievement of medieval European exploration. The discovery and settlement of Iceland beginning in 874 required navigational skills and maritime courage that surpassed anything previously attempted in European waters. The journey from Norway to Iceland covered nearly 600 miles of open ocean, with no landmarks to guide navigation except the sun, stars, and subtle changes in wind patterns and sea conditions. The Icelandic settlement attracted primarily Norwegian farmers and their households, creating a unique society that preserved many archaic Scandinavian customs while developing innovative political institutions. The Althing, established in 930, represented one of the earliest parliamentary assemblies in European history, bringing together representatives from throughout Iceland to settle disputes, pass laws, and conduct the business of government. This institution operated without a king or central executive authority, relying instead on the collective wisdom of the assembled chieftains and their ability to enforce decisions through social pressure and economic sanctions. The discovery of Greenland by Eric the Red around 982 extended Viking exploration even further into the Atlantic. Despite its forbidding name, the southern and western coasts of Greenland offered sufficient pasture to support cattle and sheep, while the surrounding waters teemed with seals, whales, and fish. The two main settlements, the eastern settlement near modern Julianahab and the western settlement near Godthab, housed several thousand colonists who maintained regular contact with Iceland and Norway through annual trading voyages. Leif Erikson's voyage to Vinland around 1000 represents the first documented European contact with North America, predating Columbus by nearly 5 centuries. The Greenland Saga and Eric the Red's Saga preserve detailed accounts of these expeditions, describing encounters with native peoples whom the Vikings called Skraelings, and attempts to establish permanent settlements along the North American coast. Archaeological evidence from Lanceau Meadows in Newfoundland confirms the Norse presence and reveals the sophisticated construction techniques they employed, even in this remote location. The establishment of the Kievan Rus demonstrated Viking capabilities in state building and cultural adaptation on a massive scale. Swedish warriors and merchants, known as Varangians, penetrated deep into the Russian river system during the 9th century, establishing trading posts and military bases along the Dnieper, Volga and Don rivers. These Scandinavian adventurers gradually merged with the local Slavic population, creating a hybrid culture that combined Norse military traditions with Slavic agricultural practices and Byzantine administrative methods. The Varangian route to Constantinople became one of medieval Europe's most important commercial arteries, carrying northern products like amber, furs, honey, and wax southward, while bringing Byzantine silk, wine, and luxury goods northward to Scandinavian markets. The annual trading expeditions involved hundreds of merchants and thousands of tons of cargo, requiring sophisticated organisation and diplomatic agreements with the various peoples along the route. The commercial treaties between the Rus and Byzantium, preserved in contemporary chronicles, reveal the complexity and scale of this international trade network. The conversion of Scandinavia to Christianity represented a gradual process that extended over several centuries and profoundly transformed Viking society. The Danish king Harald Bluetooth's conversion around 960 marked a crucial turning point, as royal adoption of Christianity encouraged similar conversions among the nobility and eventually the general population. The great runestone at Jelling, erected by Harald to commemorate his parents and proclaim his Christian faith, symbolically marked the end of the pagan era in Danish history. The process of Christianization required significant adaptations on both sides, as missionary priests learned to accommodate Scandinavian customs, while Viking converts gradually abandoned practices incompatible with Christian doctrine. The warrior culture that had driven Viking expansion proved particularly difficult to reconcile with Christian teachings about peace and forgiveness. The concept of the Christian warrior, fighting in defence of the faith rather than for personal glory and plunder, provided a compromise that allowed former Vikings to maintain their martial traditions within a Christian framework. The establishment of bishoprics in major Scandinavian cities created institutional structures that supported the new religion while providing education and administrative services. The cathedral schools at Lund, Uppsala and Trondheim became centres of learning that preserved both Christian theology and traditional Scandinavian culture. These institutions trained a new generation of clerics who could communicate effectively with both Christian and pagan populations, facilitating the gradual transformation of Scandinavian society. The Norman conquest of Sicily and southern Italy demonstrated how Viking military traditions could be adapted to Mediterranean warfare and politics. The sons of Tancred de Hauteville, including Robert Guiscard and Roger Thirst, led small bands of Norman knights southward during the 11th century, seeking opportunities for advancement in the fragmented political landscape of southern Italy. These warriors combined traditional Norse courage and tactical flexibility with the heavy cavalry techniques they had learned in northern France. The Norman conquest of England in 1066 represented the culmination of Viking military evolution and marked the end of the Viking Age proper. William the Conqueror's army at Hastings included many warriors of Scandinavian descent who had been settled in Normandy for several generations. The battle itself demonstrated how Viking tactical traditions had been transformed by continental influences, as Norman knights employed coordinated cavalry charges supported by archers rather than the individual combat preferred by their ancestors. The defeat of Harold Hardrada at Stamford Bridge just weeks before Hastings symbolically marked the end of the traditional Viking era. The Norwegian king, described as the last great Viking warrior, died leading a final attempt to conquer England through the methods that had served his predecessors for nearly 3 centuries. His death, along with the destruction of his army, demonstrated that the age of Viking raids and conquests had passed, replaced by more sophisticated forms of warfare and political organisation. The transformation of Viking warrior culture reflected broader changes in medieval European society during the 11th century. The development of feudalism, the strengthening of royal authority, and the influence of Christian doctrine all contributed to the evolution of Scandinavian military traditions. The berserkers and wolf warriors who had terrorised European monasteries gradually disappeared, replaced by Christian knights who fought according to codes of chivalry, rather than the pursuit of personal glory and material wealth. The collapse of Carolingian central authority after the death of Charles the Fat in 887 created a power vacuum that fundamentally transformed the political landscape of Western Europe. Local strongmen, many of whom had originally served as Charlemagne's counts and dukes, found themselves governing territories that the distant Carolingian kings could no longer effectively control or defend. These regional magnates possessed the military resources necessary to protect their lands from Viking raids, Magyar invasions and Saracen attacks, while the royal armies that had once maintained imperial unity had fragmented into competing factions loyal to rival claimants to the throne. The emergence of feudalism represented not a sudden institutional change, but rather the gradual formalisation of relationships that had been developing throughout the 9th century. Warriors who had received land grants from Carolingian rulers in exchange for military service found these arrangements becoming hereditary as royal authority weakened. The personal bonds of loyalty that had bound Frankish nobles to their kings evolved into contractual relationships based on mutual obligation, with lords providing protection and land in return for military service and counsel from their vassals. The feudal contract, when fully developed, created a complex web of personal relationships that extended from the lowest knight to the highest duke. A typical ceremony of homage began with a prospective vassal kneeling before his lord and placing his hands between those of his superior, symbolically placing himself under the lord's protection. The vassal would then swear an oath of fealty, promising to serve faithfully and avoid any action that might harm his lord's interests. In return, the lord would invest his vassal with a fief, typically consisting of agricultural land, but sometimes including rights to collect tolls, administer justice, or command fortifications. The military obligations inherent in feudal relationships reflected the practical necessities of 10th century warfare. A knight was expected to serve his lord for 40 days annually, fully equipped with warhorse, armour and weapons, and accompanied by a small retinue of squires and men-at-arms. This service obligation, known as knight service, provided lords with the heavy cavalry forces necessary to maintain their authority and defend their territories. The 40-day limit reflected the agricultural cycle, allowing knights to return to their estates for planting and harvest, while ensuring that military campaigns remained focused and decisive rather than becoming prolonged affairs of attrition. The development of the three-estates system provided an ideological framework that justified the social hierarchy emerging from feudal relationships. This conceptual division of society into bellatores, oratores and laboratores reflected both practical social functions and Christian theological concepts about the proper ordering of human society. Bishop Adalbero of Lyon, writing around 1020, articulated this theory in his poem to King Robert the Pious, arguing that God had ordained these three orders to work together harmoniously for the benefit of all. The bellatores, those who fought, comprised the military aristocracy that dominated feudal society. These warriors, ranging from great dukes controlling multiple counties to simple knights holding single villages, shared a common culture centered on martial prowess, personal honor, and the pursuit of glory through combat. The typical knight of the 11th century stood approximately 5 feet 6 inches tall, with a powerful build developed through years of training with heavy weapons and armor. His equipment represented a substantial investment, often costing as much as 20 oxen, or the annual income from several peasant holdings. The knight's primary weapon, the sword, had evolved considerably from the simple iron blades carried by Carolingian warriors. 11th century swords featured pattern-welded construction, with hard steel edges welded to a flexible iron core that provided both cutting power and resistance to breakage. These weapons, typically measuring 3 feet in length and weighing between 2 and 3 pounds, required years of training to master effectively. The crossguard protected the wielder's hand while providing balance for precise cuts and thrusts, while the pommel could serve as a striking weapon in close combat. The development of mail armour during this period provided knights with unprecedented protection, while maintaining the mobility necessary for mounted combat. A complete hauberk consisted of thousands of interlocked iron rings, each ring riveted closed and connected to 4 neighbouring rings, to create a flexible mesh that could deflect sword cuts and arrow strikes. The construction of a single hauberk required several months of skilled labour, making such armour extremely expensive and limiting its availability to the wealthy warrior elite. The knight's warhorse represented perhaps his most valuable possession, carefully bred and trained for the specific demands of medieval combat. These animals, known as destriers, stood approximately 15 hands high and possessed the strength necessary to carry an armoured rider while maintaining speed and agility in battle. The high-backed war saddle, equipped with a prominent cantle and reinforced stirrups, provided the stability needed for effective lance combat, while allowing the rider to remain mounted during the violent collision of cavalry charges. The lance had become the knight's primary offensive weapon by the late 10th century, transforming mounted warfare from individual combat to coordinated mass charges. These weapons, typically measuring 12 feet in length and constructed from ash or oak wood, featured steel points designed to penetrate mail armour through concentrated force rather than cutting action. The technique of couched lance combat, with the weapon held firmly under the right arm and supported by the body's momentum, allowed knights to deliver devastating attacks that could unhorse opponents or pierce through multiple ranks of infantry. The castle emerged as both the physical symbol and practical foundation of feudal authority during the 10th and 11th centuries. The earliest castles consisted of wooden towers constructed atop artificial mounds called mottes, surrounded by enclosed courtyards known as baileys. These structures, which could be erected in a matter of weeks using local labour and materials, provided secure bases from which lords could control their territories and defend against hostile neighbours. The motte and bailey design reflected both military necessity and available construction technology. The motte, typically rising 30 to 50 feet above the surrounding countryside, provided an elevated platform for observation and defence while making assault extremely difficult. The wooden tower, or keep, housed the lord's family and most valuable possessions, while serving as the final refuge during sieges. The bailey contained workshops, stables and quarters for the garrison, creating a self-sufficient community capable of withstanding extended blockades. Castle construction required substantial resources and demonstrated the lord's authority over his territory. The earth for a typical motte required the labour of dozens of workers for several months, while the timber for the tower and palisades demanded access to extensive forests. The specialised craftsmen needed for construction, including carpenters, blacksmiths and masons, represented a significant expense that only wealthy lords could afford. The completed castle served as a visible reminder of feudal authority, dominating the surrounding landscape and demonstrating the lord's power to protect his followers and punish his enemies. The oratores, those who prayed, encompassed the clergy from humble parish priests to powerful bishops and abbots. The church had emerged from the Carolingian period as the largest landowner in Western Europe, controlling perhaps 1/3 of all agricultural land through donations accumulated over centuries. This vast wealth provided the economic foundation for the church's political influence, while creating tensions between spiritual and temporal authority that would characterise medieval politics. The Benedictine monasteries that dotted the European landscape served as centres of agricultural innovation, manuscript preservation, and technological development. The Abbey of Cluny, founded in 909, pioneered monastic reforms that spread throughout Europe and demonstrated the potential for religious institutions to accumulate enormous wealth and influence. The Cluniac houses, eventually numbering over 1,000 monasteries, operated as a vast international network that transcended political boundaries and provided alternatives to purely secular sources of authority. Monastic communities developed sophisticated agricultural techniques that increased productivity and supported larger populations. The three-field system, which divided arable land into sections planted with winter grain, spring grain, and left fallow in rotation, represented a significant improvement over earlier farming methods. This system increased yields while maintaining soil fertility, supporting the population growth that characterised the 11th century. Monastic estates also pioneered the use of watermills for grinding grain and fulling cloth, technologies that would transform medieval manufacturing. The scriptorium remained the heart of monastic intellectual life, where monks copied manuscripts, illuminated texts, and preserved the literary heritage of classical antiquity and early Christianity. The development of new ink formulations, improved parchment preparation, and standardized scripts facilitated the production of books on an unprecedented scale. The monastery of Monte Cassino alone produced over 1,000 manuscripts during the 11th century, while scriptoriums throughout Europe copied works by Virgil, Ovid, Cicero, and other classical authors whose writings might otherwise have been lost. The laboratores, those who worked, comprised the vast majority of the population and provided the agricultural surplus that supported the military and clerical elites. The peasantry of the 11th century lived in small villages clustered around manor houses, with their daily lives governed by the agricultural cycle and the obligations owed to their lords. The typical peasant family occupied a single-room dwelling constructed of timber and daub, with a thatched roof and earthen floor that housed both humans and livestock during winter months. The manor system that emerged during this period created largely self-sufficient economic units that combined agricultural production with basic manufacturing. A typical manor included the lord's domain land, worked by peasant labour services, and tenant holdings cultivated by individual families in exchange for rent and feudal obligations. The manor court administered justice for minor offences, settled disputes between tenants, and enforced the customs that governed agricultural practices and social relationships. Peasant obligations varied considerably depending on local customs and the specific terms of land tenure, but generally included both labour services and payments in kind. Villein tenants typically owed their lord 2 or 3 days of work weekly on the domain land, additional labour during harvest and planting seasons, and various payments including a portion of their grain harvest and fees for using the lord's mill and oven. These obligations bound peasants to their manors while providing lords with the labour and resources necessary to maintain their military and social status. The development of chivalric ideals during the 11th century transformed the warrior culture of the feudal nobility, creating codes of conduct that emphasised honour, courtesy, and protection of the weak alongside traditional martial virtues. The Peace of God movement, initiated by church councils in southern France during the late 10th century, attempted to limit warfare by declaring certain persons and places off-limits to military action. Churches, monasteries, merchants, and non-combatants received special protection, while specific days of the week were designated as times when fighting should cease. The Truce of God extended these restrictions by prohibiting warfare during religious festivals and seasons, eventually covering nearly half the days of the year. These initiatives reflected both ecclesiastical attempts to control military violence and the growing sophistication of feudal society, which required predictable periods of peace for agricultural work and commercial activity. The enforcement of these truces depended largely on the voluntary cooperation of the warrior nobility, who found that adherence to chivalric codes enhanced their social status and political authority. The tournament emerged as both a training ground for military skills and a social institution that reinforced chivalric values. These elaborate events, which became increasingly popular during the 11th century, provided knights with opportunities to display their prowess while establishing social connections and negotiating political alliances. The early tournaments consisted of mock battles fought with real weapons over extensive areas, often resulting in serious injuries and occasional deaths that demonstrated the genuine martial skills required for success. The economic foundations of feudal society rested on agricultural production that had increased substantially since the Carolingian period. The introduction of the heavy plough, capable of turning the dense soils of northern Europe, allowed cultivation of previously unusable land, while increasing yields on existing fields. The horse collar, which distributed weight more efficiently than earlier harnesses, enabled horses to replace oxen for many agricultural tasks, increasing the speed and efficiency of farming operations. The expansion of arable land through forest clearance and marsh drainage created new opportunities for settlement and agricultural development. The great forests that had covered much of Europe since the end of the Roman Empire gradually gave way to fields, villages, and pastures as population growth created demand for additional farmland. This process of internal colonization provided lords with new sources of revenue, while offering peasants opportunities to improve their condition through settlement on newly cleared land. The development of local markets and the revival of commercial activity reflected the increased agricultural productivity and population growth of the 11th century. Weekly markets in manor villages allowed peasants to exchange surplus produce for manufactured goods, while larger towns hosted annual fairs that attracted merchants from distant regions. The gradual reintroduction of coined money, which had nearly disappeared during the 9th and 10th centuries, facilitated these commercial transactions and enabled more complex economic relationships. The transformation of European monasticism during the 10th century began with a single monastery nestled in the hills of Burgundy. The Abbey of Cluny, founded in 909 by Duke William the Pious of Aquitaine, received an unprecedented charter that placed it directly under papal protection while exempting it from all secular interference. This revolutionary arrangement allowed the Cluniac community to develop according to purely spiritual principles, free from the political machinations and economic pressures that had corrupted many earlier monastic foundations. The abbey's first abbot, Berno of Baum, established rigorous standards for liturgical observance and monastic discipline that would soon spread across Europe like ripples across a still pond. The Cluniac interpretation of the rule of St. Benedict emphasised elaborate liturgical ceremonies that consumed most of the monks' waking hours. The community celebrated the divine office with unprecedented magnificence, incorporating complex musical compositions, precious vestments, and ornate ceremonial objects that transformed the simple Benedictine services into spectacular displays of religious devotion. The monks spent nearly 8 hours daily in choir, chanting the psalms and prayers that they believed maintained the cosmic balance between heaven and earth. This liturgical focus reflected a fundamental shift in monastic priorities, from the manual labour emphasised by Benedict toward purely spiritual activities that demonstrated the monk's separation from worldly concerns. The architectural grandeur of Cluny III, begun in 1088, embodied the community's theological vision in stone and timber. The church stretched nearly 600 feet in length, making it the largest building in the Christian world until the construction of St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. 5 towers crowned the structure, their bells calling the faithful to prayer across the Burgundian countryside. The interior featured elaborate carved capitals depicting biblical scenes and moral allegories, while the high altar gleamed with gold and precious stones donated by kings and nobles throughout Europe. The sheer scale of the construction required resources that dwarfed those available to most secular rulers, demonstrating the extraordinary wealth that flowed into Cluniac coffers from grateful benefactors seeking spiritual intercession. The expansion of the Cluniac network proceeded through a combination of reform, foundation and absorption that eventually encompassed over 1,500 religious houses across Europe. Existing monasteries that had fallen into decay or corruption could request Cluniac reform, receiving new abbots and communities trained in the Burgundian customs. Wealthy patrons founded new houses specifically as Cluniac dependencies, while some established monasteries voluntarily submitted to Cluniac authority in exchange for spiritual guidance and administrative support. This vast confederation operated under the direct authority of the Abbot of Cluny, who appointed priors to govern individual houses and conducted regular visitations to ensure compliance with Cluniac customs. The economic foundation of Cluniac expansion rested on the systematic exploitation of agricultural estates and the careful management of donated properties. The abbey's scribes maintained detailed cartularies documenting every grant, purchase and exchange, creating comprehensive records that enabled efficient administration of scattered holdings. Cluniac houses pioneered new agricultural techniques, including improved crop rotation systems and the systematic breeding of livestock, that increased productivity while providing surplus income for building projects and charitable activities. The monasteries also developed extensive networks of dependent churches, collecting tithes and offerings that supplemented their agricultural revenues. The spiritual influence of Cluny extended far beyond its immediate dependencies through the promotion of pilgrimage and the development of the Camino de Santiago. Cluniac houses along the pilgrimage routes to Compostela provided hospitality, protection and spiritual guidance to thousands of pilgrims annually, while their churches served as waypoints where travellers could venerate relics and receive indulgences. The Codex Calixtinus, compiled at Cluny during the 12th century, provided detailed guidance for pilgrims, including route descriptions, advice on local customs, and accounts of miracles associated with various shrines. This systematic promotion of pilgrimage strengthened Cluniac influence throughout Europe while generating substantial revenues from grateful pilgrims. The relationship between the Cluniac monasteries and secular authorities reflected the complex tensions inherent in medieval society between spiritual and temporal power. Kings and nobles who founded or endowed Cluniac houses expected prayers for their souls and those of their families, along with political support during conflicts with rivals. The monks provided these services while maintaining their theoretical independence from secular interference, creating relationships that benefited both parties while occasionally generating conflicts over specific obligations and privileges. The Cluniac exemption from episcopal authority sometimes brought the monasteries into conflict with local bishops, who resented the loss of jurisdiction over wealthy religious houses within their dioceses. The investiture controversy that erupted during the late 11th century represented the most serious challenge to the medieval synthesis of spiritual and temporal authority since the coronation of Charlemagne. The immediate cause of the conflict lay in the competing claims of popes and emperors to control episcopal appointments, but the underlying issues involved fundamental questions about the nature of Christian society and the proper relationship between church and state. Emperor Henry IV's practice of investing bishops with ring and staff, the symbols of their spiritual authority, implied that episcopal power derived from imperial grant rather than divine appointment. Pope Gregory VII, elected in 1073, brought to the papal office a revolutionary vision of ecclesiastical independence that challenged centuries of imperial control over church appointments. Born Hildebrand of Savannah, Gregory had served as a papal legate and administrator for over 2 decades, gaining intimate knowledge of the corruption and political manipulation that characterized much of the contemporary church hierarchy. His Dictatus Papae, issued in 1075, articulated papal claims to universal authority that included the right to depose emperors, release subjects from oaths of allegiance, and exercise supreme jurisdiction over all Christian rulers. The confrontation between Gregory VII and Henry IV escalated rapidly from diplomatic protests to open warfare that divided Europe into competing factions. Henry's appointment of Tedald as Archbishop of Milan in defiance of papal objections prompted Gregory to threaten excommunication unless the emperor submitted to papal authority over episcopal appointments. Henry responded by summoning a council of German bishops at Worms in 1076, where 24 prelates declared Gregory deposed from the papal office for exceeding his legitimate authority. This direct challenge to papal supremacy forced Gregory to employ the Church's ultimate spiritual weapon, excommunicating Henry and releasing his subjects from their oaths of loyalty. The political consequences of Henry's excommunication demonstrated the practical power that papal authority could wield over medieval rulers. The German nobility, many of whom had their own grievances against imperial policies, used the excommunication as justification for rebellion against Henry's rule. The princes demanded that Henry obtain papal absolution within a year or face deposition, forcing the emperor to undertake the humiliating journey to Canossa in the depths of winter 1077. The image of the Holy Roman Emperor standing barefoot in the snow outside Gregory's castle became one of the most powerful symbols of papal supremacy in medieval political thought. The reconciliation at Canossa, while temporarily resolving the immediate crisis, failed to address the fundamental issues that had caused the conflict. Henry received absolution after 3 days of public penance, but both parties interpreted the ceremony differently. Gregory viewed it as imperial submission to papal authority, while Henry considered it merely the fulfillment of technical requirements that allowed him to resume his imperial functions. The underlying tensions over investiture rights remained unresolved, leading to renewed conflict when Henry invaded Italy in 1081 and installed an anti-pope in Rome. The military campaigns that followed Gregory's flight from Rome revealed the limitations of papal power when confronted by determined imperial opposition. Henry's forces occupied the Eternal City in 1084, forcing Gregory to seek refuge in the Castel Sant'Angelo, while the imperial anti-pope Clement III performed Henry's imperial coronation. The intervention of Norman forces under Robert Guiscard rescued Gregory from immediate danger but resulted in the sack of Rome and the Pope's exile to Salerno, where he died in 1085, still defiant but politically defeated. The eventual resolution of the investiture controversy through the Concordat of Worms in 1122 established principles that would govern church-state relations for centuries. The agreement distinguished between the spiritual and temporal aspects of episcopal office, allowing the emperor to invest bishops with secular authority while reserving spiritual investiture to ecclesiastical superiors. This compromise recognized both papal supremacy in spiritual matters and imperial authority over the temporal aspects of episcopal office, creating a framework for cooperation that reduced direct conflicts while maintaining the essential interests of both parties. The emergence of new monastic orders during the late 11th and early 12th centuries reflected growing dissatisfaction with the elaborate liturgical practices and accumulated wealth of the Cluniac houses. The Carthusian order, founded by Pruno of Cologne at the Grande Chartreuse in 1084, represented the most radical departure from traditional Benedictine monasticism through its emphasis on eremitical life within a communal framework. Each Carthusian monk occupied a separate cell with its own garden and workshop, meeting with his brethren only for certain liturgical services and communal meals on feast days. The Carthusian daily routine combined the solitary contemplation of the hermit with the stability and mutual support of community life. The monks spent most of their time in individual prayer, study, and manual labour within their cells, emerging only for matins, lauds, and vespers in the community church. Each cell contained a bed, desk, bookshelf, and tools for whatever craft the monk practiced to support himself and contribute to the community's welfare. The small garden attached to each cell provided vegetables and herbs while offering opportunities for contemplative labour that complemented intellectual and spiritual activities. The architectural layout of Carthusian monasteries reflected their unique approach to monastic life. The cells formed a square around a central cloister, with each dwelling separated from its neighbours by walls that ensured privacy and silence. The church occupied one side of the square, while the refectory, chapter house, and other common buildings filled the remaining spaces. This arrangement allowed the community to function as a collection of hermitages while maintaining the institutional structure necessary for effective governance and spiritual direction. The Cistercian order, founded at Citeaux in 1098, pursued monastic reform through a return to the literal observance of the rule of St. Benedict, rejecting what they viewed as Cluniac corruptions of authentic Benedictine spirituality. The founding fathers of Citeaux, led by Abbot Robert of Molesme, sought to restore the balance between prayer, study, and manual labour that they believed Benedict had intended, while eliminating the elaborate ceremonies and material luxuries that characterise contemporary monasticism. Their white habits, worn instead of the traditional black, symbolise their commitment to purity and simplicity in all aspects of monastic life. Bernard of Clairvaux emerged as the most influential figure in Cistercian expansion and the dominant religious personality of the 12th century. Entering Citeaux in 1112 with 30 companions, including 4 of his brothers, Bernard combined extraordinary spiritual gifts with remarkable administrative abilities and rhetorical skills that made him the most sought-after preacher in Europe. His foundation of Clairvaux in 1115 began a period of explosive Cistercian growth that saw the establishment of over 300 houses within 50 years of the order's foundation. The Cistercian approach to agricultural development revolutionised medieval farming practices and contributed significantly to the economic expansion of the 12th century. The white monks deliberately established their monasteries in remote locations, often in marshes, forests, or other undeveloped areas that required extensive clearing and drainage before cultivation became possible. Their systematic approach to land improvement included the construction of elaborate systems of canals, dikes, and mills that transformed marginal lands into productive agricultural estates. The Cistercian use of conversi, or lay brothers, provided the labour force necessary for their ambitious agricultural projects while maintaining the contemplative focus of the choir monks. These lay brothers, who took monastic vows but did not participate in the full liturgical life of the community, handled the physical work of farming, construction and manufacturing that supported the monastery's operations. The conversi lived in separate quarters, followed a simplified religious routine, and remained under the authority of the choir monks while enjoying the spiritual benefits of monastic life. The technological innovations developed in Cistercian monasteries included improvements in hydraulic engineering, metallurgy, and agricultural equipment that spread throughout medieval Europe. The monks constructed sophisticated water management systems that powered mills for grinding grain, fulling cloth, and operating bellows for metalworking. Their forges produced iron tools and weapons of exceptional quality, while their workshops manufactured textiles, leather goods, and other products that generated substantial revenues for the communities. The architectural style developed by the Cistercians reflected their theological emphasis on simplicity and their rejection of decorative elements that might distract from prayer and contemplation. Cistercian churches featured clean lines, minimal ornamentation, and careful proportions that created spaces conducive to meditation and worship. The prohibition against figured sculpture, stained glass windows, and elaborate altarpieces created interiors of austere beauty that focused attention on the liturgical action rather than artistic display. The mendicant orders that emerged during the 13th century represented a fundamental departure from traditional monasticism through their rejection of stable property ownership and their commitment to apostolic poverty. Francis of Assisi, the son of a wealthy cloth merchant, experienced a religious conversion around 1205 that led him to embrace radical poverty and dedicate his life to serving the poor and preaching repentance. His initial followers, known as the Friars Minor or Little Brothers, lived as wandering preachers who supported themselves through begging and manual labour while proclaiming the gospel to all who would listen. The Franciscan approach to religious life challenged fundamental assumptions about the relationship between material wealth and spiritual authority that had characterised medieval Christianity. Francis insisted that his followers own nothing individually or collectively, relying entirely on divine providence and human charity for their daily needs. This radical poverty extended to their clothing, which consisted of rough tunics tied with rope cords, and their dwellings, which were simple huts or abandoned buildings that provided minimal shelter from the elements. The rapid growth of the Franciscan movement created organisational challenges that required modifications to Francis's original vision of absolute poverty and complete freedom from institutional structures. Pope Innocent III's approval of the Franciscan rule in 1209 began a process of institutionalisation that continued throughout the 13th century as the order developed administrative hierarchies, established permanent houses of study, and accumulated property necessary for their expanding educational and pastoral activities. The Dominican order, founded by Domingo de Guzman around 1216, combined the mendicant commitment to apostolic poverty with a specific focus on preaching and theological education. Dominic's experience combating Cathar heresy in southern France had convinced him that effective preaching required thorough theological training and a lifestyle that demonstrated authentic Christian poverty. The Order of Preachers, as the Dominicans were officially known, established houses of study in major university towns and produced some of the most influential theologians and philosophers of the medieval period. The Dominican educational system created a network of schools that provided advanced training in theology, philosophy, and preaching techniques for members of the order and secular students. The Studium Général at Paris became the model for Dominican houses of study throughout Europe, offering courses in scripture, systematic theology, and pastoral care that prepared friars for their preaching missions. The order's emphasis on intellectual formation produced scholars like Albertus Magnus and Thomas Aquinas, whose theological syntheses shaped medieval thought and continue to influence Christian doctrine. The construction of Gothic cathedrals during the 12th and 13th centuries represented the most visible expression of medieval Christian spirituality and the extraordinary resources that communities were willing to dedicate to religious purposes. The rebuilding of the Abbey Church of Saint-Denis under Abbot Suger between 1140 and 1144 established the architectural principles that would define Gothic style for the next 3 centuries. Suger's innovative use of pointed arches, ribbed vaulting, and large windows created interior spaces that seemed to soar toward heaven while flooding the sanctuary with coloured light that symbolised divine illumination. The technical innovations that made Gothic architecture possible included the development of flying buttresses, which transferred the lateral thrust of high stone vaults to external supports while allowing the construction of walls that were primarily composed of windows. The pointed arch distributed weight more efficiently than the rounded arches of Romanesque buildings, enabling the construction of taller and more spacious interiors. The ribbed vault system concentrated structural loads on specific points, allowing builders to eliminate much of the solid wall mass that had characterised earlier architectural styles. The Cathedral of Notre Dame de Paris, begun in 1163, demonstrated the full potential of Gothic engineering and established Paris as a centre of architectural innovation. The cathedral's nave rose to a height of 115 feet, while its flying buttresses created a complex external skeleton that supported the stone vaults while maintaining the structural integrity of the building. The western facade featured 3 elaborately carved portals depicting the Last Judgment, the life of the Virgin Mary, and the story of St. Anne, creating a comprehensive programme of religious instruction for the largely illiterate population. The stained glass windows that filled Gothic churches created environments of extraordinary beauty, while serving important didactic functions for medieval congregations. The windows of Chartres Cathedral, completed during the early 13th century, contain over 150 individual scenes depicting biblical narratives, saints' lives, and moral allegories that provided comprehensive religious education for viewers who could not read written texts. The deep blues and reds that dominate these windows were produced through closely guarded techniques that achieved intensity and permanence, unmatched by later glass-making methods. The financing of cathedral construction required unprecedented cooperation between ecclesiastical authorities, royal governments, and urban communities that demonstrated the central importance of religious faith in medieval society. The Cathedral of Amiens, begun in 1220, was funded through a combination of episcopal resources, royal grants, and contributions from the city's guilds and individual citizens. The construction process typically extended over several generations, with successive bishops, architects, and craftsmen contributing to projects that might require a century or more to complete. The social impact of cathedral building extended far beyond the religious sphere, creating employment for thousands of craftsmen and labourers, while stimulating related industries throughout the surrounding regions. The construction of a major cathedral required quarrymen, transporters, masons, carpenters, glaziers, metalworkers, and dozens of other specialised trades that developed new techniques and training methods to meet the demands of these massive projects. The cathedral schools that often accompanied these building campaigns provided education for clergy and laypeople while preserving and transmitting the technical knowledge necessary for continued architectural development. The cathedral building campaigns that had transformed the European landscape during the 11th century created a spiritual fervour that Pope Urban II would harness for an entirely different purpose on November the 27th, 1095. Standing before the assembled clergy and nobility at the Council of Clermont, the Pope delivered a speech that would unleash nearly 2 centuries of religious warfare and fundamentally alter the relationship between Western Europe and the Eastern Mediterranean. Urban's call for a holy war to liberate Jerusalem from its current rulers represented a revolutionary concept that merged traditional Germanic warrior culture with Christian theological principles, creating the ideological foundation for the crusading movement. Urban's motivations for launching the First Crusade reflected both immediate political pressures and long-term strategic considerations that extended far beyond simple religious enthusiasm. Emperor Alexios the Komnenos had appealed to the West for military assistance against the Seljuk Turks, whose expansion had reduced Byzantine territory to a fraction of its former extent. The Pope recognised that a successful expedition to the east could reunite the Eastern and Western churches under papal authority, while providing an outlet for the military energies of the European nobility that had been devastating the countryside through constant feudal warfare. The response to Urban's appeal exceeded all expectations, as thousands of knights, peasants and clergy took the cross and began preparing for the arduous journey to the Holy Land. The participants came from every level of society, united by a complex mixture of religious devotion, desire for adventure, hope of material gain, and the promise of plenary indulgence that would remit all sins and guarantee immediate entry into heaven for those who died in God's service. The crusading vow, marked by the sewing of a cloth cross onto the participants' clothing, created a sacred obligation that could not be abandoned without incurring excommunication and social disgrace. The military preparations for the First Crusade revealed both the strengths and limitations of late 11th century European warfare. The heavy cavalry that dominated Western battlefields possessed superior weapons and armour compared to most Eastern forces, but their tactical doctrines had developed for the limited campaigns typical of feudal conflicts, rather than the extended expeditions required for Eastern warfare. The knights' 40-day service obligation proved completely inadequate for campaigns that might last several years, while their dependence on elaborate supply trains made rapid movement across hostile territory extremely difficult. The People's Crusade, led by the charismatic preacher Peter the Hermit, demonstrated the dangers of inadequate preparation and poor leadership that would plague many subsequent expeditions. This massive movement of peasants, minor clergy and impoverished knights began departing for the east during the spring of 1096, months before the official departure date established for the main expedition. The undisciplined crowds that followed Peter possessed neither the military skills nor the financial resources necessary for successful campaigning, leading to disasters in Hungary and complete destruction at the hands of the Seljuks near Nicaea. The main crusading armies that departed during the autumn of 1096 represented the military elite of Western Europe, led by experienced commanders who had learned their trade in the constant warfare of the feudal period. Godfrey of Bouillon brought the disciplined heavy cavalry of Lotharingia, while Bohemond of Taranto led Norman knights whose fathers had conquered Sicily and southern Italy. Raymond of Toulouse commanded the largest contingent, drawing upon the wealth and manpower of southern France, while Robert of Normandy and Robert of Flanders contributed the military expertise of northern French knighthood. The Siege of Nicaea in May and June 1097 provided the Crusaders with their first major victory and demonstrated the effectiveness of combining Western siege techniques with Byzantine naval support. The city's massive walls and strategic position on Lake Ascanius had made it virtually impregnable to previous attackers, but the Crusaders' systematic approach to siege warfare gradually wore down the defenders' resistance. The construction of elaborate siege engines, including mangonels, trebuchets and mobile towers, showcased the advanced military engineering that European craftsmen had developed during the castle-building boom of the previous century. The Battle of Dorylaeum on July 1st, 1097, tested the Crusaders' ability to adapt their tactical methods to Eastern warfare and established their reputation for military prowess that would influence subsequent campaigns. The Seljuk army under Kilij Arslan employed traditional steppe tactics, using mounted archers to harass the crusading column while avoiding direct engagement with the heavily armoured Western knights. The initial Seljuk attacks created panic among the Crusaders' infantry and camp followers, but the disciplined response of the heavy cavalry eventually turned the tide of battle. The crusading victory at Dorylaeum resulted from tactical innovations that combined traditional Western strengths with adaptations to Eastern conditions. The knights learned to maintain closer formations that prevented enemy archers from isolating individual warriors, while the infantry developed techniques for protecting the cavalry's horses from arrow fire. The coordination between different national contingents, despite language barriers and traditional rivalries, demonstrated the unifying power of the crusading ideal and the military leadership skills of the expedition's commanders. The Siege of Antioch, lasting from October 1097 to June 1098, became the defining experience of the First Crusade and established many of the patterns that would characterize subsequent crusading warfare. The massive city, protected by walls that stretched for miles across mountainous terrain, possessed sufficient supplies to withstand a lengthy blockade, while the Crusaders faced increasing difficulties maintaining their own forces through the harsh Syrian winter. The siege evolved into a race between the defenders' endurance and the attackers' ability to maintain their army in hostile territory, far from any reliable supply base. The Crusaders' eventual capture of Antioch through the treachery of Firuz, an Armenian tower commander, demonstrated the importance of local allies and intelligence networks in Eastern warfare. The night assault on June 3, 1098, succeeded because Bohemond had spent months cultivating relationships with potential collaborators within the city while gathering detailed information about the defenders' routines and weaknesses. The massacre that followed the city's fall reflected both the Crusaders' religious fervour and their desperate need to eliminate potential threats before the expected arrival of a relieving army under Kaboga. The establishment of the Principality of Antioch under Bohemond's rule created the first Crusader state and established precedents for the political organisation of subsequent conquests. Bohemond's refusal to honour his oath to return captured territories to the Byzantine Empire reflected the practical difficulties of maintaining loyalty to distant overlords while governing conquered territories that required immediate military and administrative attention. The Principality's feudal structure, with Bohemond granting fiefs to his followers in exchange for military service, transplanted Western European political institutions to the Eastern Mediterranean while adapting them to local conditions. The final approach to Jerusalem during the summer of 1099 tested the Crusaders' remaining strength, after nearly 3 years of continuous campaigning that had reduced their numbers from perhaps 100,000 to fewer than 15,000 effective fighters. The spiritual significance of their destination provided powerful motivation for the surviving Crusaders, but the practical challenges of besieging one of the most strongly fortified cities in the region required careful planning and the construction of elaborate siege equipment from materials that had to be transported across miles of hostile territory. The Siege of Jerusalem, lasting from June 7th to July 15th, 1099, culminated in an assault that combined religious enthusiasm with sophisticated military engineering. The construction of siege towers, battering rams and protective mantlets required the skills of experienced craftsmen and the labour of the entire army, while the coordination of simultaneous attacks from multiple directions demanded careful timing and communication. The final assault on July 15th succeeded when Godfrey of Bouillon's tower reached the northern wall, allowing the first Crusaders to breach the city's defences and open the gates for their comrades. The massacre that followed Jerusalem's capture reflected both the religious fanaticism that had sustained the Crusaders through their long ordeal and the military customs of the period that denied quarter to defenders who refused to surrender before an assault. Contemporary accounts describe streets running with blood as the Crusaders killed virtually every inhabitant they could find, regardless of age or gender. The slaughter continued for 3 days before the survivors were enslaved and the city's wealth distributed among the victorious armies. The establishment of the Kingdom of Jerusalem under Godfrey of Bouillon created the most important and enduring of the Crusader states, serving as the focal point for subsequent crusading efforts and the model for Latin political organisation in the East. Godfrey's adoption of the title Defender of the Holy Sepulchre rather than king reflected both personal humility and practical recognition that ruling the city where Christ had died required different legitimacy than ordinary royal authority. The kingdom's constitution, codified in the Assizes of Jerusalem, created a feudal structure that balanced the rights of the crown with the privileges of the nobility while adapting Western legal traditions to Eastern conditions. The military organisation of the Crusader states reflected the constant threat of attack from surrounding territories and the limited manpower available for defence. The feudal levies that had sufficed for European warfare proved inadequate for the extended campaigns required to defend scattered territories against determined opponents with superior numbers. The development of a professional military class, supported by the agricultural surplus of conquered territories and the profits of Mediterranean trade, created a distinctive warrior culture that combined Western military traditions with Eastern tactical innovations. The Knights Templar emerged during the 1120s as the first military religious order, combining monastic vows with military service in an unprecedented institutional arrangement that would profoundly influence medieval warfare and spirituality. The order's founding by Hugh de Pin and 8 companions reflected the practical need for a permanent military force to protect pilgrims travelling between the coastal ports and Jerusalem, but their adoption of religious vows created a new form of religious life that sanctified warfare in defence of the faith. The Templars' initial headquarters in the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which the Crusaders believed to be Solomon's temple, gave the order its name and emphasised its connection to the biblical history of Jerusalem. The Templar rule, based on the Cistercian constitution but modified for military purposes, created a disciplined organisation that could maintain its effectiveness despite the constant dangers of Eastern warfare. The knights took vows of poverty, chastity and obedience while dedicating their lives to defending Christian pilgrims and territories. The order's distinctive white mantles, marked with red crosses, became symbols of Christian military prowess throughout the Eastern Mediterranean, while their reputation for courage and discipline made them the most feared opponents of the various powers that sought to reconquer the Crusader states. The rapid expansion of Templar influence reflected both the order's military effectiveness and the generous donations of European nobility, who viewed support for the military orders as a form of crusading by proxy. The Templars established commanderies throughout Western Europe to manage their growing estates and recruit new members, creating an international network that could transfer resources and personnel between Europe and the East as military needs required. The Order's banking activities, developed to facilitate the transfer of funds for crusading expeditions, made the Templars one of the wealthiest and most powerful institutions in medieval Europe. The Knights Hospitaller, originally founded as the Hospital of St. John to care for sick pilgrims, gradually evolved into a military order that rivaled the Templars in wealth and influence, while maintaining its charitable activities. The Hospitallers' black mantles with white crosses distinguished them from their Templar rivals, but both orders developed similar military capabilities and played crucial roles in defending the Crusader states. The rivalry between the two orders sometimes undermined the coordination of Christian military efforts, but their competition also drove innovations in military technology and tactics that enhanced the overall effectiveness of Crusader armies. The Teutonic Knights, established during the Third Crusade, focused their activities on the Baltic region, where they led the systematic conquest and Christianization of pagan tribes in Prussia and Livonia. The Order's military campaigns against the Prussians, Lithuanians and other Baltic peoples employed the same combination of religious ideology and military efficiency that characterized crusading warfare in the East. But the Northern Crusades aimed at permanent territorial conquest rather than the liberation of existing Christian populations. The Teutonic Knights' methodical approach to colonization, involving the construction of fortified towns and the settlement of German peasants, created lasting changes in the demographic and cultural composition of the Baltic region. The military architecture developed in the Crusader states reflected both the defensive needs of isolated Christian territories and the adaptation of Western castle-building techniques to Eastern conditions. The great fortress of Crac des Chevaliers, rebuilt by the Hospitallers during the 12th century, exemplified the massive concentric fortifications that the military orders constructed to control strategic positions and provide secure bases for military operations. The castle's double walls, elaborate gatehouses, and sophisticated water storage systems enabled small garrisons to withstand lengthy sieges while maintaining control over important trade routes and agricultural regions. The economic impact of the Crusades extended far beyond the immediate military costs of expeditionary warfare, creating new patterns of trade and cultural exchange that transformed both European and Eastern Mediterranean societies. The establishment of Italian merchant colonies and Crusader ports provided Western Europe with direct access to Asian luxury goods, while introducing Eastern commercial practices and financial instruments to European markets. The profits from this expanded trade helped finance subsequent crusading expeditions, while creating powerful commercial interests that influenced European foreign policy for centuries. The Second Crusade, proclaimed in 1147 following the fall of Edessa, demonstrated both the continuing appeal of the crusading ideal and the increasing sophistication of anti-crusading resistance in the East. The expedition's failure, despite the participation of King Louis VII of France and Emperor Conrad III, reflected improved coordination among the various powers opposing the Crusader states, and the military lessons learned from previous encounters with Western armies. The disastrous crossing of Anatolia, where both royal armies suffered severe casualties from Seljuk attacks, revealed the continuing challenges of maintaining large European armies in hostile eastern territories. The rise of Saladin during the 1170s created the most serious threat that the Crusader states had faced since their establishment, as the Kurdish general succeeded in unifying Egypt and Syria under a single authority dedicated to reconquest. Saladin's military reforms created professional armies capable of matching Crusader heavy cavalry, while his diplomatic skills enabled him to coordinate resistance efforts across the entire region. The Battle of Hattin on July 4th, 1187, demonstrated the effectiveness of these reforms as Saladin's forces destroyed the largest Crusader army ever assembled, capturing King Guy of Jerusalem and most of the military order's leadership. The fall of Jerusalem on October 2nd, 1187, shocked Western Europe and prompted the Third Crusade, which brought together the most powerful rulers of the age in an unprecedented display of royal participation in crusading warfare. Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, King Philip Augustus of France, and King Richard the Fleur of England each led substantial armies eastward. But the expedition's ultimate failure to recapture Jerusalem demonstrated the limits of Western military power when confronted by unified and determined Eastern resistance. Richard's victories at Arsuf and Jaffa established his reputation as the greatest warrior of his generation, while his negotiations with Saladin secured Christian access to Jerusalem and the coastal cities that remained under Crusader control. The intellectual ferment that accompanied the Crusades created an unprecedented hunger for knowledge throughout Western Europe, as returning warriors brought back not only relics and plunder, but also manuscripts, philosophical treatises, and accounts of sophisticated Eastern learning that challenged existing European scholarship. The cathedral schools that had preserved literacy during the darkest centuries after Rome's fall found themselves inadequate to meet the growing demand for advanced education, particularly in law, medicine, and theology. The transformation began in the Italian city of Bologna, where Irnerius, a master of grammar and rhetoric, began lecturing on Roman law around 1088, attracting students from across Europe who sought training in the legal expertise increasingly demanded by the expanding bureaucracies of church and state. The emergence of Bologna as Europe's first university reflected both practical necessity and intellectual innovation that would reshape medieval education. The city's strategic position on the Via Aemilia, connecting northern Italy with Rome, had made it a natural centre for legal disputes involving merchants, pilgrims, and competing political authorities. The recovery of Justinian's Corpus Juris Civilis during the late 11th century provided a comprehensive legal framework that far exceeded the fragmentary Germanic law codes in sophistication and applicability to complex commercial and administrative situations. Irnerius and his successors, known as the Four Doctors, developed the glossatorial method of legal interpretation that involved detailed commentary on specific passages of Roman law, creating a systematic approach to jurisprudence that could be taught and applied consistently. The student population that flocked to Bologna represented a new social phenomenon in medieval Europe, as young men from merchant families, minor nobility, and ecclesiastical households sought the specialised knowledge that could advance their careers in an increasingly complex world. These students, typically ranging in age from 14 to 25, organised themselves into nations based on geographical origin, creating mutual support networks that provided protection, financial assistance, and collective bargaining power with local authorities and masters. The University of Bologna's unique structure, where students hired and paid their professors directly, reflected the practical orientation of legal education and the commercial background of many participants. The teaching methods developed at Bologna established patterns that would influence European education for centuries. The morning lectures, delivered in Latin to audiences that might number in the hundreds, focused on specific texts that students were expected to memorize and analyze. The master would read passages aloud, provide grammatical explanations, offer historical context, and present interpretative commentaries that reveal the underlying principles governing legal decisions. The afternoon sessions, known as repetitiones, allowed for more detailed discussion of complex points and provided opportunities for advanced students to demonstrate their understanding through public disputations. The success of the Bologna model inspired similar developments in Paris, where the Cathedral School of Notre Dame had already achieved prominence under masters like William of Champeaux and Peter Abelard. The Parisian approach to higher education emphasised theological and philosophical studies rather than law, reflecting the city's role as a centre of ecclesiastical learning and the French monarchy's strong ties to the church. The masters at Paris developed the scholastic method that would dominate medieval intellectual life, combining rigorous logical analysis with systematic examination of authoritative texts to resolve apparent contradictions and establish consistent doctrinal positions. Peter Abelard's revolutionary approach to theological education transformed the intellectual landscape of 12th century Europe through his application of dialectical reasoning to religious questions that had previously been accepted on faith alone. Born into a minor noble family in Brittany, around 1079, Abelard possessed an extraordinary intellect and argumentative temperament that made him both the most celebrated and most controversial teacher of his generation. His method, exemplified in the Sic et Non, involved collecting apparently contradictory statements from Scripture, the Church Fathers, and ecclesiastical authorities, then using logical analysis to reconcile these differences or determine which authorities carried greater weight. The intellectual courage that Abelard displayed in questioning established authorities extended to his personal life, where his affair with Heloise, the brilliant niece of Canon Fulbert, resulted in secret marriage, violent retribution, and ultimate separation that became one of the most famous love stories in medieval literature. The castration that Fulbert's servants inflicted upon Abelard ended his secular career, but intensified his focus on theological questions, leading to conflicts with Bernard of Clairvaux and other conservative churchmen who viewed his rational approach to religious mysteries as dangerous to faith and ecclesiastical authority. The University of Paris that emerged from these cathedral schools during the late 12th century established the institutional framework that would be copied throughout northern Europe. The papal bull Parens Scientiarum, issued by Gregory IX in 1231, granted the university corporate privileges that included the right to strike, freedom from local taxation, and exemption from secular courts. These privileges attracted scholars from throughout Europe while providing the legal foundation for academic freedom that enabled masters to pursue controversial questions without fear of immediate political retaliation. The four faculties that comprised the medieval university reflected both the hierarchy of knowledge and the practical needs of medieval society. The Faculty of Arts, which all students entered first, provided instruction in the 7 liberal arts that form the foundation of medieval education. The Trivium of Grammar, Rhetoric, and Dialectic developed the linguistic and logical skills necessary for advanced study, while the Quadrivium of Arithmetic, Geometry, Astronomy, and Music provided mathematical and scientific knowledge. Students typically spent 4 to 6 years earning their Bachelor of Arts degree before proceeding to advanced study in theology, law, or medicine. The Faculty of Theology, regarded as the Queen of Sciences, attracted the most brilliant minds of the medieval period and produced the great scholastic syntheses that attempted to reconcile Aristotelian philosophy with Christian doctrine. The theological curriculum required extensive study of Scripture, the Church Fathers, and the sentences of Peter Lombard, which served as the standard textbook for systematic theology. Students progressed through clearly defined stages, from bachelor to master to doctor, with each level requiring demonstrated competence in disputation, lecturing, and original scholarship. The recovery of Aristotelian philosophy through Arabic translations during the 12th century created both opportunities and challenges for Christian scholars who recognised the power of Aristotelian logic, while worrying about its implications for religious faith. The works of Aristotle, transmitted through scholars like Averroes and Avicenna, provided systematic approaches to natural philosophy, ethics, and metaphysics that far exceeded anything available in the Christian West. The initial ecclesiastical suspicion of these works, reflected in their temporary prohibition at Paris in 1210, gradually gave way to efforts to integrate Aristotelian insights with Christian theology. Albertus Magnus, the German Dominican who taught at Paris during the 1240s, pioneered the systematic study of Aristotelian natural philosophy within a Christian context. Albert's encyclopedic knowledge encompassed not only Aristotelian texts, but also works on astronomy, alchemy, botany, and zoology that he synthesized into comprehensive accounts of natural phenomena. His willingness to conduct original observations and experiments, combined with his mastery of both Christian and pagan authorities, established him as one of the greatest scholars of the medieval period and prepared the way for his student Thomas Aquinas to achieve the definitive synthesis of Aristotelian philosophy and Christian theology. Thomas Aquinas arrived at the University of Paris in 1245 as a young Dominican friar, whose aristocratic family had opposed his decision to join the mendicant orders. His massive intellect and systematic approach to theological questions enabled him to construct the most comprehensive and influential synthesis in medieval thought. The Summa Theologica, begun around 1265, employed the scholastic method to address virtually every aspect of Christian doctrine, from the existence of God to the resurrection of the body, creating a systematic theology that remained authoritative in Catholic thought for centuries. The Thomistic synthesis resolved the apparent conflict between reason and faith by arguing that both derived from God and therefore could not ultimately contradict each other. Natural reason, operating through Aristotelian logic and empirical observation, could demonstrate truths about the natural world and even prove God's existence, while revealed truth provided knowledge about supernatural realities that exceeded human reason's natural capacity. This integration of philosophy and theology provided Christian scholars with powerful intellectual tools while maintaining the primacy of religious authority in matters of faith and morals. The scholastic method that reached its peak in Aquinas' work involved a highly structured approach to intellectual problems that reflected both the medieval love of systematic organisation and the practical needs of university education. Each question began with arguments supporting opposing positions, followed by a definitive response that typically drew upon authoritative sources while employing logical analysis to resolve apparent contradictions. This method, displayed in thousands of disputed questions and systematic treatises, trained generations of scholars in rigorous thinking while creating a vast literature that addressed virtually every conceivable intellectual problem. The University of Oxford, established during the late 12th century, developed its own distinctive intellectual tradition that emphasized empirical observation and mathematical analysis alongside the theological and philosophical studies that dominated Paris. The English university's collegiate system, with individual colleges providing residential and tutorial instruction within the larger university framework, created intimate learning environments that fostered close relationships between masters and students. The rivalry between Oxford and Cambridge, which emerged as a separate university after a migration from Oxford in 1209, stimulated intellectual competition that enhanced the quality of English scholarship. Roger Bacon, the Franciscan friar who taught at Oxford during the 13th century, exemplified the English emphasis on empirical investigation and experimental method. Bacon's Opus Meius, written for Pope Clement IV around 1267, argued that direct observation and mathematical analysis provided more reliable knowledge than reliance on ancient authorities, anticipating scientific methods that would not become widespread until the early modern period. His investigations into optics, astronomy and alchemy, combined with his advocacy for educational reform, established him as one of the most original thinkers of the medieval period. The development of canon law as a distinct academic discipline reflected the Church's growing administrative complexity and the need for trained lawyers to handle ecclesiastical legal matters. The Decretum of Gratian, compiled around 1140, provided a systematic collection of church law that served as the foundation for canonical jurisprudence. The subsequent papal decretals, collected in various compilations culminating in the Liber Extra of Gregory IX, created a comprehensive legal system that governed ecclesiastical affairs throughout Western Europe. The University of Bologna's preeminence in legal education made it the natural centre for canonical studies. While other universities developed their own schools of canon law to meet local needs, Civil law studies based on Justinian's Roman law provided training for the growing number of lawyers needed by secular governments, commercial enterprises, and private individuals involved in increasingly complex legal relationships. The revival of Roman law during the 12th century coincided with the expansion of trade, the growth of urban communities, and the strengthening of royal governments, all of which required sophisticated legal expertise. The law schools that developed throughout Europe, from Bologna and Orleans to Salamanca and Prague, created a common legal culture that transcended political boundaries while providing practical training for administrative careers. Medical education during the medieval period combined classical authorities like Galen and Hippocrates with Arabic medical texts that had preserved and expanded ancient knowledge. The medical school at Salerno, established during the 9th century, pioneered systematic medical education in Western Europe and attracted students from throughout the Mediterranean world. The Salernitan masters developed comprehensive curricula that included anatomy, surgery, pharmacy, and clinical practice, creating the first systematic approach to medical training in medieval Europe. The University of Montpellier, established during the late 12th century, became the leading centre for medical education in Northern Europe, developing teaching methods that combined theoretical instruction with practical experience. The medical faculty required students to master classical and Arabic medical texts, while gaining hands-on experience through hospital work and supervised clinical practice. The licensing requirements established by medical faculties created professional standards that distinguished trained physicians from the various folk healers, barber surgeons, and charlatans who also practiced medicine during the medieval period. The rise of vernacular literature during the late medieval period reflected both the expansion of literacy beyond clerical circles and the growing confidence of European cultures in their own linguistic traditions. The universities, while maintaining Latin as the language of formal instruction, increasingly produced graduates who could write effectively in their native languages, creating new forms of literature that combined learned and popular traditions. The emergence of vernacular theology, law, and natural philosophy made scholarly knowledge accessible to broad audiences while contributing to the development of national literary traditions. The architectural development of university towns reflected both the practical needs of academic communities and the symbolic importance of learning in medieval society. The University of Paris gradually acquired buildings throughout the Latin Quarter, with individual colleges constructing elaborate complexes that included lecture halls, libraries, chapels, and residential quarters. The Sorbonne, founded by Robert de Sorbonne in 1257, became the model for collegiate architecture with its systematic arrangement of functional spaces around courtyards that facilitated both study and community life. The daily routine of medieval university life combined rigorous intellectual work with the religious observances and social activities that characterized all medieval institutions. Students attended morning lectures, participated in afternoon disputations, and spent evenings in private study or informal discussion with their fellows. The academic year, punctuated by religious festivals and seasonal breaks, provided a rhythm that balanced intensive study periods with opportunities for rest and recreation. The elaborate ceremonies that marked academic promotions, from the bachelor's determination to the master's inception, created public recognition for scholarly achievement while reinforcing the university's corporate identity and social importance. The transformation of European economic life during the 11th and 12th centuries proceeded hand in hand with the intellectual revolution occurring in the universities, as the same forces that drove scholastic inquiry also stimulated commercial innovation and urban development. The agricultural surplus generated by improved farming techniques and the internal colonization of previously uncultivated lands provided the foundation for a dramatic expansion of trade and manufacturing that would reshape the social and political structures of medieval Europe. The population growth that had begun during the 10th century accelerated throughout the following centuries, creating both the labour force necessary for increased production and the consumer demand that drove commercial expansion. The revival of urban life began in Italy, where geographic position, political fragmentation, and commercial traditions combined to create ideal conditions for mercantile development. The Italian cities had never completely disappeared during the early medieval period, but their populations had shrunk dramatically, and their economic functions had become primarily administrative and religious rather than commercial. The renewed contact with the Eastern Mediterranean through the Crusades, combined with the wealth generated by providing transport and supplies for the expeditions, enabled Italian merchants to rebuild the trade networks that had once connected Europe with Asia and Africa. Venice emerged as the dominant commercial power in the Eastern Mediterranean through a combination of geographic advantages, political acumen, and military capability that enabled the city to exploit the opportunities created by the Crusades while avoiding the political entanglements that hampered other Italian cities. The Venetian lagoon provided natural protection from both land-based armies and hostile fleets, while the city's position at the head of the Adriatic gave it control over the Alpine passes that connected Central Europe with the Mediterranean. The Doge and his council of merchant aristocrats pursued a consistently pragmatic foreign policy that prioritized commercial advantage over religious or political ideology, enabling Venice to maintain profitable relationships with both Christian and Islamic rulers. The Fourth Crusade's diversion to Constantinople in 1204 demonstrated the extent of Venetian commercial ambition and the willingness of the merchant republic to subordinate religious goals to economic interests. Doge Enrico Dandolo, despite his advanced age and blindness, orchestrated the expedition's redirection from Egypt to the Byzantine capital, where Venetian forces played a crucial role in the city's capture and subsequent partition. The establishment of Venetian trading colonies throughout the Eastern Mediterranean, following Constantinople's fall, created a commercial empire that stretched from the Black Sea to Alexandria, generating enormous profits to finance further expansion and military capabilities. The Venetian fondico system established the institutional framework for long-distance trade that would be copied throughout the Mediterranean world. These fortified warehouse complexes, located in major commercial centres from Constantinople to Alexandria, provided secure storage for goods, accommodation for merchants, and protection for Venetian citizens conducting business in foreign territories. The fondicos operated under extraterritorial privileges that exempted Venetian merchants from local laws and taxes while providing access to local markets and commercial opportunities. This system enabled relatively small numbers of Venetian merchants to conduct business across vast distances while maintaining the security and legal protections necessary for profitable commerce. Genoa developed as Venice's primary rival through different strategies that emphasized military conquest and territorial expansion rather than purely commercial relationships. The Genoese possessed superior naval technology, including improved ship designs and more effective weapons, that enabled them to compete successfully with Venice for control of eastern Mediterranean trade routes. The Genoese colonies established in the Black Sea region, particularly at Kaffa in the Crimea, provided access to the fur trade and slave markets that generated substantial profits while connecting Genoa to the overland routes leading to Central Asia and China. The commercial rivalry between Venice and Genoa escalated into a series of wars that devastated Mediterranean trade, while demonstrating the military capabilities that the Italian city-states had developed. The War of Chioggia, fought from 1378 to 1381, brought Venice to the brink of destruction as Genoese forces occupied the lagoon and besieged the city itself. The Venetian recovery, achieved through desperate mobilization of all available resources and the construction of an entirely new fleet, demonstrated the resilience of the merchant republic while establishing Venetian supremacy in the Eastern Mediterranean for the remainder of the medieval period. The development of banking and credit systems during this period reflected the growing complexity of commercial relationships and the need for financial instruments that could facilitate trade across long distances and extended time periods. The Italian merchants who dominated Mediterranean commerce faced constant challenges in transferring funds, exchanging currencies, and providing credit for commercial ventures that might require months or years to complete. The solutions they developed, including letters of credit, bills of exchange, and partnership agreements, created the foundation for modern commercial banking while enabling the expansion of trade on an unprecedented scale. The Medici Bank, established in Florence during the 14th century, exemplified the sophisticated financial institutions that emerged from Italian commercial innovation. The bank's network of branches, extending from London to Constantinople, provided comprehensive banking services including currency exchange, commercial loans, and investment management that supported both local and international trade. The Medici family's combination of banking expertise with political influence enabled them to dominate Florentine politics while accumulating one of the largest fortunes in medieval Europe. The development of double-entry bookkeeping during the 13th century provided merchants with systematic methods for tracking complex financial transactions and evaluating the profitability of different commercial ventures. This accounting innovation, first documented in Italian commercial records, enabled merchants to maintain accurate records of assets, liabilities, and profits, while providing the financial information necessary for informed business decisions. The widespread adoption of double-entry methods created standardized approaches to commercial accounting that facilitated partnerships between merchants from different cities and countries. The expansion of trade networks beyond the Mediterranean connected European merchants with Asian markets through both overland and maritime routes that brought unprecedented varieties of goods to European consumers. The Silk Road, revitalized by Mongol conquest that created political stability across Central Asia, carried Chinese silk, Indian spices, and Central Asian luxury goods westward, while transporting European silver, woolen textiles, and manufactured goods eastward. The profits from this transcontinental trade financed the commercial revolution that transformed European economic life, while introducing new products and technologies that enhanced European living standards. The Hanseatic League emerged in Northern Europe as a commercial confederation that rivaled the Italian city-states in economic importance, while developing distinctive institutional arrangements suited to Baltic and North Sea conditions. The League began as an association of German merchants trading in foreign cities, particularly Novgorod and London, who banded together for mutual protection and commercial advantage. The gradual transformation of this merchant association into a confederation of cities created a unique political and economic entity that dominated northern European trade for over 2 centuries. Lübeck served as the unofficial capital of the Hanseatic League, coordinating the activities of member cities while providing leadership for collective military and diplomatic initiatives. The city's strategic position on the Baltic Sea, combined with its excellent harbour and commercial infrastructure, made it the natural centre for trade between Western Europe and the Baltic region. The Lübeck Law Code, adopted by dozens of cities throughout Northern and Eastern Europe, created standardised legal frameworks for commercial transactions while facilitating the expansion of German merchants and settlers into previously undeveloped territories. The Hanseatic trading posts, known as contours, established German commercial dominance in major northern European cities through a combination of economic leverage and political privilege. The Steelyard in London, the Peterhof in Novgorod, the Kontor in Bergen, and the establishment in Bruges operated as semi-autonomous German enclaves that controlled specific trades while maintaining extraterritorial privileges that exempted Hanseatic merchants from local laws and taxes. These institutions enabled relatively small numbers of German merchants to dominate the trade in essential commodities including grain, timber, furs, and fish that connected the Baltic region with Western European markets. The military capabilities of the Hanseatic League reflected both the wealth generated by commercial success and the need for armed force to protect trading privileges against hostile rulers and competing merchants. The League maintained its own naval forces, capable of blockading entire coastlines and conducting amphibious operations against cities that violated Hanseatic commercial rights. The wars against Denmark during the 14th century demonstrated the League's ability to coordinate military action among dozens of member cities while achieving political objectives through economic pressure and naval warfare. The guild system that developed in medieval cities provided institutional frameworks for organising production, regulating quality, and maintaining social order within urban communities that were growing rapidly and becoming increasingly complex. The craft guilds that emerged during the 11th and 12th centuries represented associations of skilled artisans who shared common economic interests and social concerns. These organisations established standards for apprenticeship, controlled entry into specific trades, regulated prices and working conditions, and provided mutual assistance for members facing economic hardship or personal crises. The guild structure typically included 3 distinct levels that reflected both skill development and economic status within each craft. Apprentices, usually boys between the ages of 12 and 16, worked without wages while learning the basic techniques of their chosen trade. The apprenticeship period, lasting from 3 to 7 years depending on the craft's complexity, provided comprehensive training in both technical skills and commercial practices while ensuring adequate labour supplies for established masters. Journeymen, who had completed their apprenticeships but had not yet achieved independent status, worked for wages while saving money and gaining experience necessary to establish their own workshops. The masterpiece system provided the mechanism through which journeymen could achieve independent status and full guild membership. The aspiring master was required to produce an example of his craft that demonstrated complete technical competence and artistic ability, often under the supervision of existing masters who evaluated both the quality of the work and the candidate's suitability for guild membership. The successful completion of a masterpiece, combined with payment of substantial fees and proof of sufficient capital to establish an independent workshop, entitled the new master to full participation in guild activities and the right to train apprentices. The merchant guilds that developed alongside craft guilds represented associations of traders who controlled wholesale commerce and long-distance trade within specific urban markets. These organisations, typically dominated by wealthy merchants engaged in international trade, regulated commercial practices, negotiated with foreign suppliers and customers, and often exercised significant political influence within their cities. The merchant guilds frequently conflicted with craft guilds over pricing, quality standards, and market access, creating tensions that reflected the complex economic relationships within medieval urban communities. The guild system extended beyond purely economic functions to encompass religious, social, and political activities that made these organisations central institutions in medieval urban life. Each guild maintained its own chapel or altar, celebrated the feast day of its patron saint, and provided for masses for deceased members, creating religious communities that reinforced occupational identities. The guild halls that dominated many medieval city centres served as meeting places, commercial exchanges, and symbols of corporate pride that demonstrated the wealth and importance of specific trades within the urban hierarchy. The regulation of working conditions and commercial practices by guild authorities created standardised approaches to production and trade that enhanced consumer confidence while protecting both producers and customers from fraud and exploitation. The guild inspectors who examined finished goods, verified weights and measures, and investigated complaints provided quality control mechanisms that enabled medieval cities to develop reputations for specific products that could command premium prices in distant markets. The guild courts that adjudicated disputes between members, enforced regulations, and punished violations created legal frameworks that supplemented municipal and royal justice systems. The rise of textile production as the dominant manufacturing industry in medieval Europe reflected both the availability of raw materials and the development of sophisticated production techniques that enabled European craftsmen to compete with imported fabrics while creating new products for both domestic and foreign markets. The woolen industry that emerged in Flanders during the 12th century combined English wool with Flemish manufacturing expertise to produce high-quality textiles that were exported throughout Europe and the Mediterranean. The cities of Ghent, Bruges and Ypres became major industrial centres where thousands of workers participated in the complex processes required to transform raw wool into finished cloth. The technical innovations that revolutionised textile production included improvements in spinning, weaving and finishing techniques that increased both productivity and quality while reducing production costs. The spinning wheel, introduced during the 13th century, enabled workers to produce thread much more rapidly than traditional spindles while achieving greater consistency in thickness and strength. The horizontal loom, combined with improved techniques for warping and threading, allowed weavers to produce larger pieces of cloth with more complex patterns, while reducing the physical effort required for weaving operations. The fulling mills that processed woven cloth represented one of the most important applications of water power to medieval manufacturing, enabling the production of high-quality woolen textiles on an unprecedented scale. These mills employed rotating hammers powered by water wheels to clean, thicken and strengthen woven cloth through mechanical action that replaced the laborious process of fulling by foot. The systematic application of water power to textile production created the first examples of mechanized manufacturing in medieval Europe, while demonstrating the potential for technological innovation to transform traditional crafts. The emergence of a distinct merchant class during this period represented a fundamental transformation in European social structure, as successful traders accumulated wealth that rivaled that of the traditional landed nobility while developing cultural values and political interests that often conflicted with established social hierarchies. The merchant families that dominated urban commerce typically invested their profits in real estate, manufacturing enterprises, and financial ventures that provided multiple income sources while reducing dependence on any single commercial activity. These diversified investment strategies enabled successful merchants to weather economic downturns while accumulating the capital necessary for expansion into new markets and activities. The social aspirations of the merchant class reflected both their economic success and their desire for recognition and acceptance within existing social hierarchies that had traditionally excluded commercial activities from positions of honour and respect. Wealthy merchants purchased rural estates, constructed elaborate urban palaces, and sought marriages with noble families as means of achieving social advancement while maintaining their commercial interests. The tension between commercial values that emphasized practical success and traditional aristocratic values that emphasized military service and landed wealth created cultural conflicts that would influence European social development for centuries. The political influence exercised by merchant communities within medieval cities reflected both their economic importance and their organisational capabilities. A successful coordination of commercial activities provided experience in collective decision-making and resource management that translated readily into political leadership. The merchant oligarchies that governed many medieval cities developed sophisticated administrative systems, maintained professional military forces, and conducted independent diplomatic relations that rivaled the capabilities of traditional feudal authorities. The commune movement that spread throughout Europe during the 11th and 12th centuries represented the institutional expression of urban political autonomy, as cities sought formal recognition of their right to self-governance and exemption from feudal obligations that hindered commercial development. The commune movement that spread throughout Europe during the 11th and 12th centuries represented the institutional expression of urban political autonomy, as cities sought formal recognition of their right to self-governance and exemption from feudal obligations that hindered commercial development. However, by 1300, the prosperity and expansion that had characterized the High Middle Ages began to encounter unprecedented challenges that would fundamentally transform European society. The agricultural productivity that had sustained population growth for 3 centuries reached its limits as available arable land became fully exploited and existing farming techniques proved incapable of supporting further expansion. The delicate balance between population and resources that had enabled medieval prosperity was about to collapse under the weight of demographic pressure and climatic deterioration. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1322 marked the beginning of a prolonged crisis that shattered the optimism and expansion of the High Middle Ages. The disaster began with exceptionally heavy rains during the spring of 1315 that continued throughout the growing season, preventing proper planting and destroying crops across northern Europe. The summer brought no relief, as continuous precipitation rotted grain in the fields and made harvesting impossible in many regions. The autumn rains that followed completed the agricultural catastrophe, leaving vast areas of Europe without adequate food supplies as winter approached. The meteorological conditions that produced the Great Famine reflected broader climatic changes that mark the end of the medieval warm period and the beginning of what would later be called the Little Ice Age. The warming trend that had enabled agricultural expansion into marginal lands and supported larger populations began to reverse around 1300, bringing cooler temperatures, increased precipitation, and more frequent extreme weather events. The alpine glaciers that had retreated during the warmer centuries began advancing again, destroying villages and agricultural lands that had been cultivated for generations. The agricultural crisis extended far beyond simple crop failure, as the intensive farming methods developed during the population boom of the 12th and 13th centuries had exhausted soil fertility, while clearing forests that had previously moderated local climates. The three-field system that had enabled increased production could not compensate for depleted soils that required longer fallow periods to recover their productivity. The expansion of cultivation onto marginal lands, including steep hillsides and poorly drained areas, made agriculture particularly vulnerable to adverse weather conditions that would have been manageable on better soils. The demographic impact of the Great Famine proved devastating across northern Europe, where populations that had grown continuously for 3 centuries suddenly faced mass starvation. Contemporary chronicles describe scenes of unimaginable suffering as entire families died of hunger, while survivors resorted to eating bark, grass, and even human flesh to stay alive. The city of Ypres, which had supported over 40,000 inhabitants at its peak, lost approximately 10% of its population during the famine years. Rural areas suffered even more severely, with some villages losing half their inhabitants to starvation and disease. The social breakdown that accompanied the famine revealed the fragility of medieval civilization when faced with sustained crisis. The elaborate systems of mutual obligation that bound peasants to lords and provided social stability during normal times collapsed as desperate people abandoned their holdings to search for food in other regions. The roads filled with refugees carrying their few remaining possessions while seeking relief that rarely materialized. Banditry increased dramatically as former peasants turned to robbery and violence to survive, making travel dangerous and disrupting the trade networks that might have alleviated local shortages. The urban populations that had grown dramatically during the commercial expansion of the High Middle Ages proved particularly vulnerable to famine conditions, as cities depended entirely on agricultural surplus from surrounding countryside. The grain markets that had enabled urban growth could not function when there was simply no surplus to purchase at any price. The wealthy merchant families that had accumulated vast fortunes during the prosperous centuries found their wealth meaningless when food was unavailable regardless of price. The social tensions that had simmered between rich and poor erupted into violence as starving masses attacked the granaries and warehouses of those suspected of hoarding food supplies. The ecclesiastical response to the famine demonstrated both the Church's continued moral authority and its practical limitations when confronted with catastrophe beyond human control. Bishops organised relief efforts and opened church granaries to feed the hungry, but ecclesiastical resources proved inadequate to address the scale of suffering. The clergy called for prayers, processions, and acts of penance to appease divine wrath, while theologians struggled to explain how benevolent God could permit such widespread suffering among faithful Christians. Some religious movements interpreted the famine as divine punishment for the sins of the age, particularly the growing materialism and luxury of urban life. The recovery from the Great Famine occurred gradually during the 1320s as weather patterns returned to more normal conditions and agricultural production slowly increased. However, the demographic losses and economic disruption of the famine years had permanently altered European society. The population levels that had been achieved by 1300 would not be reached again for over a century, while the confidence in continued growth and expansion that had characterized the High Middle Ages gave way to anxiety about the future and awareness of civilization's vulnerability to forces beyond human control. The agricultural innovations that emerged in response to the famine included efforts to improve crop yields through better seed selection, more systematic fertilization, and the introduction of new crops that could provide nutrition during years when traditional grains failed. Some regions began cultivating legumes more extensively, as beans and peas could fix nitrogen in the soil while providing protein-rich food for human consumption. The cultivation of vegetables and household gardens increased significantly as families sought to reduce their dependence on grain purchases by producing their own food supplies. The Black Death that struck Europe in 1347 represented a catastrophe of even greater magnitude than the Great Famine, killing between 1/3 and 1/2 of the European population within 5 years. The plague arrived through the trade networks that had connected Europe with Asia, carried by Genoese merchants fleeing the siege of Kaffa in the Crimea. The disease spread with terrifying speed along the commercial routes that had brought prosperity to medieval Europe, reaching Sicily by October 1347 and spreading northward through Italy during the winter months. The pathology of the Black Death manifested in 3 distinct forms that contemporaries recognised as separate diseases, but which modern medicine identifies as different presentations of bubonic plague, caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis. The bubonic form, characterised by painful swellings in the lymph nodes called buboes, developed over several days and killed approximately 60% of its victims. The pneumonic form, which attacked the lungs and spread through airborne droplets, proved almost universally fatal within 2 or 3 days. The septicemic form, involving blood poisoning, killed victims within hours of the first symptoms appearing. The medical understanding of the plague reflected the limitations of medieval knowledge, while demonstrating the desperate efforts of physicians to comprehend and treat the unprecedented disease. The dominant medical theory, based on classical authorities like Galen, attributed the plague to corrupted air caused by unusual planetary alignments, earthquakes, or divine wrath. Physicians prescribed treatments including bloodletting, purging, and the application of various herbal remedies that proved completely ineffective against the bacterial infection. The failure of traditional medicine to provide any relief from the plague undermined confidence in established medical authorities and encouraged the proliferation of folk remedies and religious cures. The social impact of the Black Death extended far beyond the immediate mortality, fundamentally altering the structure of European society through the massive loss of population and the breakdown of established institutions. The plague struck all social classes, though the poor suffered disproportionately due to malnutrition, overcrowded living conditions, and limited access to medical care. Entire noble families died within days, while monasteries lost so many members that many houses ceased to function. The clergy, who provided spiritual comfort and last rites to plague victims, suffered particularly high mortality rates that left many parishes without priests. The economic consequences of the plague transformed labour relations throughout Europe as the massive population loss created acute labour shortages that dramatically increased the bargaining power of surviving workers. Peasants who had previously been bound to their lords' estates through feudal obligations found themselves able to demand higher wages, better working conditions, and greater personal freedom. The traditional feudal relationships that had structured rural society for centuries began to dissolve as lords competed for scarce agricultural workers while peasants migrated to areas offering better opportunities. The urban impact of the plague proved equally revolutionary, as the dramatic reduction in population created both challenges and opportunities for surviving city dwellers. Many cities lost half or more of their inhabitants, leaving vast areas of urban space vacant while disrupting the guild systems that had regulated medieval manufacturing and commerce. The survivors found themselves inheriting property, workshops, and commercial enterprises from deceased relatives and neighbours, creating opportunities for rapid social advancement that had been impossible during the population-dense conditions of the 13th century. The psychological trauma inflicted by the Black Death manifested in various religious and cultural movements that reflected both despair and hope in the face of unprecedented catastrophe. The flagellant movement spread across Europe as groups of lay people engaged in public self-mortification to appease divine wrath and seek forgiveness for the sins that had supposedly brought the plague upon humanity. These processions, involving hundreds or thousands of participants who whipped themselves while chanting prayers and hymns, created powerful displays of collective penance that attracted both followers and critics. The persecution of minority communities during the plague years revealed the darker aspects of medieval society under extreme stress. Accusations that certain groups had caused the plague by poisoning wells or practicing witchcraft led to massacres of communities that had previously coexisted peacefully with their Christian neighbours. The violence that erupted during the plague years reflected both the desperate search for scapegoats and the breakdown of normal social restraints under conditions of extreme crisis. The demographic recovery from the Black Death proceeded slowly and unevenly across Europe, with some regions requiring over a century to regain their pre-plague population levels. The reduced population density created opportunities for agricultural intensification and urban development that had been impossible during the overcrowded conditions of the 13th century. The abundance of vacant land enabled survivors to consolidate holdings and adopt more efficient farming methods, while the reduced competition for resources improved living standards for those who survived the initial catastrophe. The 100 Years' War between England and France, beginning in 1337 and continuing intermittently until 1453, demonstrated how military technology and tactics evolved in response to changing social and economic conditions. The conflict originated in dynastic disputes over the French succession, but its duration and intensity reflected deeper tensions over territorial control, commercial privileges, and national identity that had been developing for centuries. The war's early phases revealed the continuing effectiveness of English military innovations, while exposing the limitations of traditional French feudal armies. The English military system that achieved spectacular victories at Crécy, Poitiers, and Agincourt combined professional leadership with innovative tactics that maximised the advantages of disciplined infantry over traditional heavy cavalry. The English longbow, capable of penetrating mail armour at distances exceeding 200 yards, required years of training to master effectively, but provided devastating firepower when employed by skilled archers in coordinated volleys. The typical English archer could loose 12 arrows per minute with sufficient accuracy to target individual enemies, creating a rate of fire that overwhelmed even the most determined cavalry charges. The tactical formations developed by English commanders integrated archers with men-at-arms in defensive positions that forced enemy cavalry to attack across killing zones, where concentrated archery fire could decimate attacking forces before they reached English lines. The Battle of Crécy in 1346 demonstrated these tactics' effectiveness, as English forces numbering fewer than 10,000 men defeated a French army of over 25,000 through superior positioning, disciplined archery, and coordinated infantry support. The French heavy cavalry, representing the flower of European knighthood, charged repeatedly into the storm of arrows only to be cut down before reaching their objectives. The evolution of armour during the 100 Years' War reflected both technological innovation and tactical adaptation, as armourers sought to provide protection against increasingly effective projectile weapons. The development of plate armour during the 14th century created complete protective systems that could deflect arrows and crossbow bolts while maintaining sufficient flexibility for effective combat. The great bassinets that protected the head and neck featured articulated visors that could be raised for better vision and breathing, while providing complete facial protection during combat. The French military reforms that followed their early defeats in the 100 Years' War demonstrated the adaptability of medieval military systems when faced with tactical innovation. The creation of professional companies of men-at-arms and crossbowmen provided France with disciplined forces capable of matching English tactical effectiveness, while the development of artillery provided new capabilities for siege warfare. The French artillery train that emerged during the 15th century included massive bombards capable of breaching castle walls that had previously been considered impregnable. The social impact of the 100 Years' War extended far beyond the immediate military campaigns, transforming the relationship between rulers and subjects while accelerating the development of national consciousness in both England and France. The financial demands of sustained warfare required new forms of taxation that brought royal governments into direct contact with their subjects' economic activities. The English Parliament's control over taxation strengthened representative institutions, while the French monarchy's fiscal innovations created more centralised administrative systems. The Avignon papacy, lasting from 1309 to 1377, represented a fundamental challenge to papal authority and the unity of Western Christendom. The relocation of the papal court from Rome to Avignon occurred when Pope Clement V, a Frenchman elected through French influence, established his residence in the Rhone Valley city that technically belonged to the papal vassal kingdom of Naples, but was effectively under French control. The Avignon popes, all French nationals, appeared to be puppets of the French monarchy, undermining their credibility as universal spiritual leaders, while creating suspicions about their independence from secular political influence. The administrative efficiency achieved by the Avignon papacy paradoxically strengthened papal government while weakening papal prestige. The papal bureaucracy that developed at Avignon created systematic procedures for handling ecclesiastical appointments, legal appeals, and financial transactions that far exceeded the capabilities of the medieval Roman administration. The papal tax system that emerged during the Avignon period generated unprecedented revenues through the systematic exploitation of ecclesiastical benefices, creating wealth that supported an elaborate court culture, but also generated criticism about papal materialism and corruption. The Great Western Schism that began in 1378 created an unprecedented crisis of authority within the Catholic Church, as rival papal claimants divided European allegiance along political lines. The return of the papacy to Rome under Gregory I in 1377 was followed by his death and the election of Urban VI, whose harsh reform efforts alienated the College of Cardinals. The Cardinals' subsequent election of Clement VII, who returned to Avignon, created a situation where two men simultaneously claimed to be the legitimate pope, while excommunicating each other and their respective supporters. The political dimensions of the Great Schism reflected the broader conflicts and alliances that characterised late medieval European politics. France and its allies supported the Avignon Pope, while England and the Holy Roman Empire recognised the Roman claimant, creating a religious division that reinforced existing political tensions. The various religious orders, universities and kingdoms of Europe were forced to choose sides in a conflict that had no clear canonical resolution, undermining the unity of Western Christendom while strengthening the authority of secular rulers over their national churches. The resolution of the Great Western Schism through the Council of Constance in 1417 marked not only the restoration of papal unity, but also the emergence of a new political order in which secular monarchies had assumed unprecedented authority over their territories and subjects. The crisis of ecclesiastical leadership that had paralysed the Church for nearly 4 decades coincided with the consolidation of royal power across Europe, as kings exploited the weakness of competing papal claimants to assert greater control over national churches while developing administrative systems that penetrated deeper into society than any previous form of medieval government. The English monarchy that emerged from the constitutional conflicts of the 13th century established the most sophisticated system of royal administration in medieval Europe through the systematic development of bureaucratic institutions that could function independently of the king's personal presence. The chancery, exchequer, and courts of King's Bench and Common Pleas created permanent governmental machinery staffed by professional clerks and judges who maintained written records of their proceedings. The Chancery Rolls, beginning in 1199, preserved copies of royal letters patent and letters close, creating an administrative archive that enabled consistent policy implementation across the kingdom while providing legal precedents for future decisions. The English Exchequer developed into the most advanced financial institution in medieval Europe through the systematic application of accounting procedures that ensured accurate collection and disbursement of royal revenues. The twice-yearly audit sessions at Westminster brought sheriffs and other royal officials before the barons of the Exchequer, who examined their accounts using the distinctive checkered cloth that gave the institution its name. The pipe rolls that recorded these proceedings created comprehensive financial records that enabled royal administrators to track revenues from specific sources while identifying patterns of collection and expenditure that informed future policy decisions. The expansion of royal justice through the development of common law courts fundamentally transformed English legal culture while strengthening royal authority throughout the kingdom. The justices in Eyre, who travelled regular circuits, brought royal law directly to local communities, gradually displacing the jurisdictional authority of feudal lords and ecclesiastical courts. The standardisation of legal procedures and remedies created uniform justice that transcended regional variations while generating substantial revenues for the royal treasury through court fees and amercements imposed on losing parties. The Magna Carta of 1215 represented both a limitation on royal authority and a recognition of the king's central role in English governance, as the rebellious barons sought to constrain specific abuses rather than fundamentally alter the monarchical system. The Charter's provisions regarding due process, taxation, and ecclesiastical freedom established principles that would influence constitutional development for centuries, while creating mechanisms for baronial consultation that evolved into parliamentary institutions. The requirement that the king obtain consent for extraordinary taxation created precedents for representative government that distinguished England from continental monarchies that developed more absolutist systems. The evolution of Parliament during the 13th and 14th centuries demonstrated how royal administrative needs could create representative institutions that enhanced rather than diminished monarchical effectiveness. Edward the Steer's Model Parliament of 1295 included not only the traditional magnates, but also representatives of counties, boroughs, and lower clergy, creating a comprehensive assembly that could provide both counsel and consent for royal policies. The separation into distinct houses reflected social hierarchies, while enabling different groups to articulate their specific interests and concerns within a unified governmental framework. The parliamentary control over taxation that developed during the 14th century created a system of fiscal accountability that strengthened royal government by ensuring broader support for military expenditures and administrative reforms. The Commons' insistence on examining royal finances before granting subsidies forced kings to justify their policies while providing detailed information about governmental operations. This transparency enhanced public confidence in royal administration, while creating mechanisms for addressing grievances that might otherwise have led to rebellion or resistance. The French monarchy pursued a different path toward administrative centralisation that emphasised royal prerogative and bureaucratic expansion rather than representative consultation. The Capetian kings who succeeded to Hugh Capet's throne in 987 gradually extended their direct authority from the Ile-de-France throughout the kingdom, employing a combination of military conquest, strategic marriages, and legal innovation that transformed France from a collection of autonomous principalities into a unified territorial state. The systematic expansion of royal domain lands provided the economic foundation for administrative development while reducing the independent power of great feudal lords. The creation of baillis and sénéchaux as royal representatives in the provinces established direct royal administration that bypassed traditional feudal hierarchies while ensuring consistent implementation of royal policies. These professional administrators, typically drawn from the minor nobility or educated clergy, owed their positions entirely to royal appointment and could be removed at the king's pleasure. Their systematic rotation between different provinces prevented the development of local loyalties that might compromise their effectiveness as royal agents, while creating a cadre of experienced administrators who understood conditions throughout the kingdom. The Parliament of Paris evolved from the king's feudal court into a sophisticated judicial institution that served as the supreme court for the entire kingdom, while developing legal doctrines that enhanced royal authority. The professional judges who staffed the Parliament created a body of jurisprudence based on Roman law principles and royal legislation that gradually displaced local customs and feudal privileges. The Parliament's appellate jurisdiction over cases from throughout France created uniform legal standards while generating substantial revenues for the royal treasury through court fees and confiscations. The French monarchy's fiscal innovations during the 14th century created new forms of taxation that provided unprecedented revenues while establishing royal authority over economic activities throughout the kingdom. The gabelle, or salt tax, created a royal monopoly over an essential commodity that generated substantial income, while demonstrating the crown's ability to regulate commerce. The taille, initially an extraordinary levy for military purposes, became a regular source of revenue that enabled the monarchy to maintain professional armies and expanded bureaucracies without relying on feudal military service. The Estates General that emerged during the early 14th century reflected the French monarchy's need for broader consultation during periods of crisis while maintaining royal prerogative over fundamental policy decisions. Unlike the English Parliament, which developed regular procedures for consent taxation, the Estates General met only when summoned by the king and possessed no established rights to control royal finances or policies. The division into 3 separate estates reflected social hierarchies, while preventing the development of unified opposition to royal authority. The Holy Roman Empire faced unique challenges in developing centralized administration due to its vast territorial extent, ethnic diversity, and the competing claims of emperors and popes to universal authority. The German kings who held the imperial title ruled through a complex system of feudal relationships that granted substantial autonomy to territorial princes while maintaining theoretical imperial supremacy. The Golden Bull of 1356, issued by Emperor Charles IV, formalised the electoral procedures for choosing emperors while recognising the sovereign rights of the 7 electors within their own territories. The administrative fragmentation of the Holy Roman Empire reflected both the practical impossibilities of governing such diverse territories from a single centre and the political strength of regional rulers who had consolidated their own governmental systems. The territorial principalities that emerged during the later medieval period developed sophisticated administrative machinery that rivaled royal governments in effectiveness while maintaining nominal allegiance to imperial authority. The Duchy of Austria, Margraviate of Brandenburg, and Kingdom of Bohemia created bureaucratic systems that enabled efficient governance of their territories while contributing to the overall weakness of imperial institutions. The imperial cities that achieved direct subordination to the emperor rather than territorial princes created islands of republican government within the feudal structure of the empire. Cities like Nuremberg, Augsburg, and Frankfurt developed sophisticated constitutional systems that balanced the interests of merchant elites, craft guilds, and ordinary citizens while maintaining the commercial prosperity that justified their privileged status. The Hanseatic League's political influence demonstrated how urban confederations could exercise authority that transcended traditional territorial boundaries while maintaining loyalty to imperial institutions. The Crown of Aragon developed a distinctive federal structure that accommodated the diverse legal traditions and commercial interests of Catalonia, Aragon, Valencia, and the Balearic Islands, while maintaining unified direction for external affairs. The Aragonese Cortes possessed extensive powers over taxation and legislation that limited royal authority more effectively than most contemporary representative institutions. The Justiciar of Aragon served as a constitutional officer who could review royal actions and protect traditional privileges against monarchical encroachment, creating a system of limited monarchy that influenced later constitutional developments. The marriage of Isabel of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon in 1469 created the dynastic union that would transform Spain into Europe's most powerful monarchy, while establishing precedents for the eventual unification of diverse territories under centralised royal authority. The Catholic monarchs, as they became known, maintained separate governmental systems for their respective kingdoms, while coordinating policies regarding military campaigns, religious affairs, and overseas expansion. Their conquest of Granada in 1492 completed the Reconquista, while providing resources and experience that would enable Spanish expansion into the Americas. The Spanish Inquisition, established in 1478, demonstrated how monarchical authority could employ religious institutions to achieve political objectives while creating unprecedented mechanisms for social control. The Inquisition's jurisdiction over heresy cases enabled the Crown to investigate and prosecute individuals whose loyalty might be questionable while confiscating property that enhanced royal revenues. The development of national identities during the later medieval period reflected both the administrative consolidation achieved by successful monarchies and the cultural changes that accompanied political unification. The French monarchy's promotion of the French language in official documents and legal proceedings gradually displaced Latin and regional dialects while creating linguistic unity that reinforced political loyalty. The English monarchy's similar policies regarding English language usage served comparable purposes while distinguishing English political culture from continental European traditions. The emergence of national literatures during this period both reflected and reinforced the development of distinct political identities that transcended traditional regional and feudal loyalties. The Divine Comedy of Dante Alighieri employed vernacular Italian to create a literary masterpiece that demonstrated the cultural sophistication achievable in national languages while articulating political theories that supported imperial authority. Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales similarly established English as a literary language capable of sophisticated expression, while portraying social types and relationships that reflected distinctly English cultural patterns. The military innovations that transformed medieval warfare during the 14th and 15th centuries enhanced monarchical power by creating professional armies that could overcome traditional feudal forces while requiring financial resources that only centralized governments could provide. The development of gunpowder weapons revolutionized siege warfare by making traditional fortifications obsolete, while creating new tactical possibilities that favored disciplined infantry over heavy cavalry. The cannon that appeared on European battlefields during the 14th century could breach castle walls that had previously been impregnable, forcing military architects to develop new defensive systems while enabling monarchs to reduce rebellious nobles more effectively. The professional armies that emerged during this period combined traditional military virtues with systematic training and standardized equipment that enhanced their effectiveness while reducing their dependence on feudal military service. The French companies d'ordonnance established during the 15th century created permanent military units that served directly under royal authority while receiving regular pay and standardized equipment. These professional soldiers developed esprit de corps and tactical expertise that exceeded the capabilities of feudal levies while remaining loyal to the crown rather than individual noble commanders. The transformation of medieval monarchies during the period from 1200 to 1450 represented a fundamental shift from personal lordship based on feudal relationships to institutional kingship based on territorial sovereignty and administrative efficiency. The successful monarchies that emerged from this transformation possessed governmental machinery capable of implementing uniform policies throughout their territories while commanding resources sufficient to maintain professional armies and diplomatic services. The representative institutions that developed in some kingdoms provided mechanisms for consultation and consent that enhanced royal legitimacy while creating constitutional frameworks that would influence political development for centuries. The consolidation of territorial states during the later medieval period established the foundation for the early modern European state system that would dominate international relations until the 20th century. The monarchies that successfully centralized authority within defined territorial boundaries created the institutional precedents for absolute monarchy, while establishing the administrative capabilities necessary for overseas expansion and commercial development. The constitutional limitations that developed in some kingdoms provided alternative models for political organization that would influence later democratic developments, while demonstrating the possibility of effective government based on consent rather than coercion. The medieval period thus concluded with the establishment of governmental institutions and political concepts that would shape European development for centuries. The transformation from feudal fragmentation to territorial monarchy represented one of the most significant political achievements in human history, creating stable governmental systems capable of supporting the cultural, economic, and military developments that would enable European expansion throughout the world. The administrative innovations, constitutional principles, and national identities that emerged during the later medieval period provided the foundation for the remarkable achievements of early modern European civilization, while establishing patterns of political organisation that continue to influence contemporary governmental systems.